My name is Paige, and I am 29 years old. My parents gave my sister a $16,000 luxury Mediterranean cruise for Thanksgiving, while I got nothing but a crumpled $5 lottery ticket meant to completely humiliate me. What they did not know was that the cheap piece of paper was a jackpot winner for $86 million. By the time they found out the truth and realized their massive mistake, my phone already had 97 missed calls from them, and I never answered a single one. If you have ever been treated like the punchline to your own family's cruel joke, hit the like button and subscribe. You will want to stick around to see how this exact $5 piece of paper destroyed their entire empire. Growing up in the wealthy suburbs of Chicago, I learned very early on that love in my family was not unconditional. It was a transaction. My parents, Thomas and Barbara, measured human worth entirely by outward appearances, social status, and the ability to project an image of flawless affluence. Their sprawling, ostentatious mansion was a testament to this obsession. It featured towering fake marble pillars, a meticulously manicured lawn that cost a fortune to maintain, and a grand dining room designed specifically to intimidate guests. Inside those walls, emotional warmth was non-existent. I was always the family disappointment, simply because I chose to live in reality. As a financial risk analyst, I built my life around logic, stability, and practical planning. I preferred my quiet, comfortable apartment in the city to a flashy lifestyle I could not afford. I drove a reliable 4-year-old Honda. I saved my money. I valued independence over keeping up appearances. To my parents, my practical nature was a source of profound embarrassment. They viewed my lack of designer clothes and my refusal to pretend I was wealthy as a personal attack on their carefully crafted image. This Thanksgiving began like every other agonizing holiday at their estate. The house was suffused with the heavy scent of expensive professional catering that my mother Barbara fully intended to pass off as her own cooking. She spent the entire morning staging dirty pots and pans around the kitchen to make it look like she had been slaving over a hot stove since dawn. Meanwhile, I was the only one actually working quietly peeling a mountain of potatoes in the corner of the kitchen while the rest of the family treated the day like a high society networking event. The swinging kitchen door pushed open and in walked my older sister Brittany. At 31 years old, Brittany was the undisputed golden child of the family. She was breathtakingly beautiful in a highly manufactured way, and she spent her entire existence seeking validation on social media. She walked into the kitchen wearing a silk dress that cost more than my monthly rent, holding her phone high in the air to capture the perfect holiday selfie. She pouted her lips, adjusted the lighting, and completely ignored my presence as she narrated a live video about how exhausting the holidays were for her. Trailing right behind her was her husband, Isaiah. Isaiah is an African-American man of 33 who possesses a dangerous amount of charisma and absolutely zero financial sense. He constantly refers to himself as a pioneering crypto entrepreneur and a visionary digital investor. He wears custom-tailored suits, sports a luxury watch that I knew for a fact was a convincing replica, and talks exclusively in buzzwords about blockchain disruption and decentralized wealth. However, my risk analyst brain saw right through his polished facade. I had seen the subtle signs of his financial distress for months. The slightly panicked phone calls he took in the hallway. The unpaid notices accidentally left visible in his car. I knew Isaiah was secretly drowning in debt, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth that my parents demanded. Isaiah leaned against the granite kitchen island, swirling a glass of imported scotch. He started loudly boasting about a new digital token he was launching, claiming it was going to revolutionize the global market within the next quarter. He threw out terms like liquidity pools and algorithmic scaling with such absolute confidence that anyone without a financial background would be instantly fooled. Brittany gazed at him with manufactured adoration while posing for another photo. Then my father Thomas entered the kitchen. He was a commanding man who ran a regional logistics company with an iron fist. He walked straight past me without a greeting and clapped Isaiah proudly on the shoulder. Thomas loudly proclaimed that Isaiah was a true visionary, a man who understood how to hustle and build a real legacy. He praised his ambition and his drive, making sure his voice echoed off the high ceilings. Then Thomas slowly turned his gaze toward me. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced instantly by a cold, calculating disdain. He looked at my practical sweater and the potato peeler in my hand, as if I were a stranger who had wandered in off the street. He asked me when I was going to stop living like a hermit and finally get a real job. He told me that analyzing other people's money was a coward's way out of life, and that if I had even an ounce of the ambition Brittany and Isaiah possessed, I would not be stuck in a dead-end existence. I sat there in silence, absorbing the familiar sting of his words. I did not defend my career. I did not point out that my job paid well and offered absolute stability. I knew from years of bitter experience that logic meant nothing to a man who only respected illusion. The hostility in the kitchen continued to simmer as the afternoon wore on. Every interaction was designed to elevate the golden couple and diminish my presence. I continued my work in silence, mentally calculating the hours until I could retreat to my quiet apartment. But the true psychological warfare had not even begun. As Thomas finally turned away from me and led Isaiah toward the dining room to pour another drink, he raised his wine glass in the air. He announced that it was almost time for the annual family gift exchange. He cast one final mocking, predatory gaze over his shoulder directly at me. I could see the malicious anticipation dancing in his eyes. He had planned something special for this dinner, something designed to humiliate me completely in front of our entire extended family. Segment 2. 1,000 words. The transition to the formal dining room felt like walking into a carefully orchestrated theatrical performance. 20 members of our extended family were seated around the massive mahogany table. Aunts, uncles, and distant cousins who only appeared for free expensive food and free-flowing alcohol chattered loudly over the clinking of crystal glasses. I took my assigned seat at the very end of the table, situated near the kitchen swinging door, as if I were part of the catering staff. Brittany and Isaiah were seated directly to the right of Thomas and Barbara, occupying the places of highest honor. After the main course was cleared away, the room grew quiet with anticipation. It was time for my parents' annual display of wealth. Barbara stood up from her chair, her face glowing with intense self-satisfaction. She reached into a silver tray and pulled out a thick, glossy envelope embossed with gold lettering. She walked over to Brittany and Isaiah and handed it to them with a dramatic flourish. Barbara announced to the entire room that she and Thomas knew how incredibly hard the two of them had been working on their groundbreaking crypto ventures. She said they needed a chance to unplug and recover from their stressful executive lifestyles. Brittany tore open the envelope and let out an ear-piercing shriek of manufactured joy. She pulled out 2 VIP tickets for a $16,000 luxury Mediterranean cruise. She threw her arms around Isaiah and then rushed to dramatically hug our parents, while the rest of the table erupted in loud, enthusiastic applause. Isaiah smiled smugly, raising his glass to Thomas in a silent gesture of triumph. Then the room settled down again. Barbara returned to the silver tray. This time she did not pick up a glossy envelope. Instead, she reached to the very bottom of the tray and pinched a small, cheap piece of paper between her perfectly manicured fingers. She walked down the length of the long table, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She stopped next to my chair and dropped the item unceremoniously onto my empty plate. It was a crumpled, cheap $5 scratch-off lottery ticket. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. I looked down at the bright neon colors of the ticket and then looked up at my father at the head of the table. Thomas stood up, holding his wine glass, and offered a cruel, wide smile. He projected his voice so that every single person in the room could hear him perfectly. He announced that they really did not know what to buy someone with absolutely zero ambition. He said that since I refused to hustle or build wealth like my sister, they figured they would leave my future up to pure dumb luck. Then came the final crushing blow. Thomas told me to scratch it right now, and added that he hoped I won at least $20, so I could afford to put gas in that rusty old Honda of mine before driving back to my sad little apartment. For a second, the room held its breath. Then one of my uncles let out a harsh bark of laughter. Within seconds, the entire dining room erupted into mocking, roaring laughter. My aunts giggled behind their napkins. Isaiah shook his head in feigned pity. Brittany pointed her phone at me, clearly capturing my humiliation for her social media followers. They were all laughing at me, treating my entire existence as the ultimate family joke. I sat completely still. I did not cry. I did not yell or argue or throw my napkin down in a fit of rage. My risk analyst brain detached my emotions from the situation entirely. I looked at their laughing faces and realized with absolute clarity that I owed these people nothing. I quietly picked up the cheap ticket, excused myself from the table, and walked calmly down the hallway toward the guest bathroom. I could hear their laughter echoing behind me as I closed the heavy wooden door and locked it. The bathroom was brightly lit, with harsh fluorescent bulbs reflecting off the cold marble sink. I stood in front of the mirror, taking a slow, deep breath to steady my racing heart. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small silver quarter. I placed the wrinkled ticket flat on the marble counter. I did not expect anything. It was just a prop in their theatrical display of cruelty. I pressed the edge of the coin against the scratch-off material and began to scrape away the silver coating. The gray dust fell away into the sink. The first symbol appeared, a gold star. I scratched the next box. Another gold star. My hand paused. The statistical probability of winning anything substantial on a $5 ticket was astronomically low. I pressed the coin down again and cleared the final box in the row. A third gold star. 3 matching symbols. I stopped breathing. I moved the coin down to the prize box below the stars and scratched away the remaining silver film. The numbers revealed themselves slowly, block by block. An 8, a 6, and then 6 zeros following closely behind. I stared at the paper. I closed my eyes, opened them again, and stared at it once more. The numbers did not change. $86 million. The silence in the bathroom was absolute. My mind went entirely blank before clicking into overdrive. $86 million. It was a sum of money that defied comprehension. It was more wealth than my father had built in his entire lifetime. It was enough to alter the trajectory of my entire existence forever. A profound paradigm shift occurred within my mind in that exact second. The heavy, oppressive weight of being the family scapegoat simply evaporated. The insults, the belittling, the constant comparisons, they were completely neutralized by the tiny piece of paper resting on the marble counter. I was absolutely, undeniably free. I carefully picked up the ticket. My hands were perfectly steady. I folded the paper once and slipped it securely inside my bra, right next to my heart. I looked at my reflection in the mirror one last time. My face was entirely stone cold, betraying absolutely no emotion. I unlocked the door and walked back down the hallway. The family was still laughing and chatting loudly as I re-entered the dining room. Thomas looked up, expecting to see me crying or defeated. Instead, I walked calmly over to my chair and picked up my purse. I reached inside my wallet and pulled out a crisp new $100 bill. I dropped it right in the center of my empty plate. I looked directly at my mother and told her to keep the tip to compensate for her incredibly dry turkey. The laughter in the room died instantly. Shock washed over their faces as the insult landed. Before anyone could utter a single word of protest, I turned around and walked straight out the front door. I stepped into the cool, crisp Chicago air, leaving my toxic family behind in total silence, not knowing that their cruel joke had just handed me the keys to the world. The morning after Thanksgiving felt entirely different from any other morning of my life. I woke up in my cramped studio apartment, where the radiator clanked loudly and the drafty windows let in the bitter Chicago winter chill. For years, I had woken up in this exact bed feeling the heavy, crushing weight of financial anxiety and family expectations pressing down on my chest. Today, there was only a profound, weightless silence. I sat up and looked at the small folding table near my kitchen counter. Resting right next to my coffee mug was the $5 scratch-off ticket. The $86 million piece of paper that my parents had handed me as a cruel joke was real. I did not celebrate. I did not scream or jump around my tiny living room. As a risk analyst, My brain immediately bypassed the euphoria and went straight into strategic execution. Wealth of this magnitude was not just a blessing, it was a massive vulnerability, especially with a family like mine. If Thomas and Barbara ever found out my name was attached to a winning lottery ticket, they would unleash a legal and psychological war to claim every single penny. They would suddenly declare that family is everything and drag me through the mud to get their hands on my money. I needed an impenetrable fortress. I dressed in my sharpest business suit, grabbed my briefcase, and headed straight to downtown Chicago. I bypassed the standard lottery office entirely. Instead, I walked into the lobby of one of the most elite wealth management law firms in the city. The contrast between my chaotic family dinner the night before and the hushed mahogany-paneled corridors of this firm was striking. I sat across from a senior partner who dealt exclusively with ultra-high net worth individuals. I presented the ticket and explained my objective with absolute clarity. I did not want public recognition. I did not want my face on a giant cardboard check. I wanted total absolute anonymity. Over the next 3 hours, we established a blind trust. We named it the Phoenix Trust. Under Illinois law, a blind trust could claim lottery winnings on behalf of the victor, shielding their identity from the public record. My name would never appear in the press. The funds would be securely routed into a maze of protected corporate accounts, accessible only to me. As I signed the final stack of legally binding documents transferring the ticket to the trust, a deep sense of security washed over me. I was completely protected. Just as the senior partner shook my hand to congratulate me, my cell phone began to vibrate violently inside my briefcase. The harsh, jarring ringtone shattered the sophisticated quiet of the law office. I glanced at the screen. It was my father, Thomas. A wry smile touched the corner of my mouth. He was not calling to apologize for his behavior at Thanksgiving. Thomas never apologized. I knew exactly why he was calling, but I decided to let the situation play out. I stepped out of the conference room, walked down the silent hallway, and answered the call. Before I could even offer a greeting, Thomas launched into his aggressive, commanding tone. He told me that Isaiah was facing a massive crypto emergency. According to Thomas, his brilliant son-in-law had hit a temporary liquidity snag and needed a rapid cash injection to secure a highly lucrative digital asset deal. The reality was that Isaiah was drowning in debt, and the loan sharks were likely circling, but Thomas refused to see past the illusion. Thomas barked his demand into the phone. He said Isaiah needed a $50,000 business loan immediately. Since Isaiah had ruined his own credit with a string of failed ventures, Thomas had decided that I would co-sign the loan. He demanded that I use my flawless risk analyst credit score to secure the funds by the end of the business day. He did not ask me. He commanded me. He told me that family finances family, and that it was time for me to stop being so selfish and actually contribute to the success of the people around me. He promised that the family would pay me back within the month once Isaiah struck it rich. I stood looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 50th floor law firm, watching the tiny cars move along the Chicago streets far below. I took a slow breath. I did not argue about the sheer absurdity of his request. I did not point out that Isaiah was a fraud who had never made a successful investment in his life. I kept my voice perfectly flat, completely devoid of emotion. I told my father no. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was the first time in my 29 years of life that I had ever flatly denied a direct order from Thomas. Then the silence shattered. Thomas exploded into a furious rage. His voice echoed through the phone speaker, vibrating with genuine shock and intense malice. He demanded to know who I thought I was talking to. He called me an ungrateful, bitter failure who was purposely trying to sabotage her sister's happiness out of pure jealousy. He screamed that I owed him my life and that if I did not sign the loan documents by 5 o'clock, he would make sure I learned a very painful lesson about loyalty. I pulled the phone slightly away from my ear, allowing his toxic threats to wash over me without absorbing a single drop of his poison. My refusal was the catalyst for the next phase of his manipulation. Thomas quickly realized that his screaming was not working, so he shifted to the ultimate financial threat. He reminded me that the rusty 4-year-old Honda I drove to work every single day did not actually belong to me. When my previous car had broken down during my final year of college, he had purchased the used Honda and allowed me to drive it out of pity. He had kept the title firmly in his own name, ensuring he always held a leash around my neck. His voice dripped with cruel satisfaction as he laid out his retaliation. He told me that if I did not co-sign Isaiah's loan, he would immediately report the Honda as stolen to the police, or simply send a repo man to drag it out of my apartment parking lot. He painted a vivid picture of how humiliating it would be for me. He sneered that I would be left completely stranded, unable to commute to my sad little analyst job in the city. He wanted to strip away my independence and force me to come crawling back to the suburbs begging for his forgiveness. He told me I had exactly 2 hours to change my mind before he made the call to the authorities. He hung up the phone expecting me to dissolve into a puddle of panic and despair. I stood in the quiet hallway of the law firm and stared at the dark screen of my cell phone. A genuine laugh bubbled up in my chest. The sheer irony of his threat was staggering. My father believed he held the ultimate leverage over my entire existence because he controlled a rusted compact car worth barely $4,000. He had absolutely no idea that I had just secured $86 million in liquid assets. He wanted his leverage back. I decided to return it to him with exceptional customer service. I opened my phone browser and searched for a premium heavy-duty towing company located in the affluent suburb where my parents lived. I did not want a standard tow truck. I wanted a massive industrial flatbed vehicle, the kind designed to transport heavy machinery. I called the dispatch office and offered to pay triple their standard rate for a highly specific, immediate delivery. The dispatcher eagerly agreed. I gave him the address of my apartment building and the address of my parents' sprawling estate. I provided very explicit instructions on exactly how I wanted the delivery executed. I took a cab back to my apartment building. I gathered the few personal items I kept in the Honda, wiped down the dashboard, and retrieved my parking permit. Within 30 minutes, the massive industrial flatbed truck pulled into my street, roaring loudly. I handed the driver the keys and a generous cash tip. I told him to make sure the car was placed exactly where I had requested. Then I opened my ride-sharing app and requested an Uber Black SUV. I wanted to witness the delivery personally, but I absolutely refused to arrive in a battered sedan. The drive to the suburbs took 45 minutes. I sat in the plush leather back seat of the luxury SUV, sipping a bottle of sparkling water, feeling an unparalleled sense of calm. As we turned onto the long, winding road leading to my parents' neighborhood, I saw the massive tow truck lumbering just ahead of us. We followed it directly to their property. My parents' house sat on a massive corner lot, featuring a perfectly manicured emerald green lawn that Barbara spent thousands of dollars maintaining every month. It was her absolute pride and joy, a flawless velvet carpet designed to make the neighbors violently jealous. The tow truck did not park in the street. Following my strict financial incentives, the driver backed the massive heavy-duty vehicle straight over the curb. The huge tires sank deep into the soft, pristine grass, ripping up massive chunks of soil and leaving deep, muddy trenches across the pristine landscaping. The truck backed up until it was sitting directly in the center of the front lawn, right in front of the grand mahogany double doors. The hydraulic lift engaged with a loud mechanical whine. The bed tilted backward, and the rusty silver Honda rolled off, hitting the grass with a heavy thud. The front door of the mansion flew open. Barbara ran out onto the porch wearing her silk bathrobe, her face contorted in a mask of absolute horror. She began screaming hysterically, waving her arms at the tow truck driver, demanding to know what he was doing to her award-winning lawn. Thomas burst out a moment later, his face purple with rage, shouting threats of lawsuits and property damage. The tow truck driver calmly ignored them. He walked over to the outdoor garbage bin, picked up the Honda's keys, and tossed them casually into the trash, just as I had instructed. He climbed back into his cab and drove off, leaving massive muddy ruts across the ruined grass. My Uber Black slowly pulled up to the curb, pausing directly in front of the chaos. I lowered the tinted passenger window. Barbara stopped screaming at the receding tow truck and locked eyes with me. Her jaw dropped open in shock as she took in the sight of me sitting in the back of the sleek luxury vehicle. Thomas stood frozen on the porch, staring at the rusted car, sitting entirely abandoned on his ruined lawn. I leaned slightly out the window. I did not raise my voice. I looked directly at my father and told him his property had been officially returned. I thanked him for the loan and told him to enjoy the landscaping. I tapped the partition separating me from the driver, and the sleek black SUV accelerated smoothly away from the curb. I did not look back. I simply rolled the tinted window up, shutting out the sound of Barbara's frantic screaming as we drove back toward the city, leaving their false empire to deal with the mud. The Uber Black glided smoothly through the dark streets of Chicago, carrying me far away from the chaotic mud-slick disaster I had just created on my parents' front lawn. I leaned back against the plush leather seat and watched the city lights blur past the tinted windows. I was not heading back to my cramped, drafty studio apartment to panic about the future. I was already making my next calculated moves. My phone chimed softly in the quiet cabin. It was an encrypted notification from the elite wealth management firm I had hired earlier that day. The massive wire transfer had officially cleared. $86 million was now sitting securely in the newly established Phoenix Trust corporate accounts. The sheer magnitude of that number did not make me want to buy a fleet of flashy sports cars or instantly broadcast my victory to the world. I am a risk analyst. My very first priority was to establish an impenetrable fortress where no one, especially my family, could ever reach me. Operating entirely through a blind shell corporation, I finalized the immediate cash purchase of a $6 million ultra-secure penthouse in the heart of downtown Chicago. I had found the listing during my lunch break and authorized the firm to execute the closing paperwork the moment the funds hit. The penthouse occupied the entire 50th floor of a premier high-rise building. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Lake Michigan and the sprawling city skyline. More importantly, it was essentially a vault in the sky. The residence was accessible only via a private biometric elevator code and monitored by a 24-hour dedicated security team. I spent the remainder of the evening systematically erasing my physical and digital footprint. I deleted every social media account I possessed. I hired a specialized privacy service to scrub my public records from internet databases. I changed my primary phone number and email addresses. I was becoming a ghost, dissolving into the upper echelons of extreme wealth where privacy is the ultimate luxury. As I stood in the center of my expansive new living room, watching the city lights reflect off the dark waters of the lake, my old phone screen lit up. It was not a message of concern or a sudden realization of their horrible behavior. It was a rapid-fire strobe of furious texts from my sister Brittany. I watched the messages roll in one after another, each more unhinged and entitled than the last. Brittany was absolutely livid about the Honda incident. She claimed I had severely traumatized our mother and completely ruined the aesthetic of their front lawn right before the holiday season. She called me a deeply jealous psycho who was lashing out because I could not handle her success. Then she seamlessly pivoted to her actual reason for contacting me. The narcissism was breathtaking. She declared that in order to make up for my horrible disrespect, I was now required to come to her luxury downtown apartment, clean it from top to bottom, and dog-sit her two high-maintenance poodles entirely for free. She and Isaiah were leaving for their $16,000 Mediterranean cruise the very next morning. She stated that doing this massive favor was the least I could do since I clearly had no life of my own and owed the family a massive debt of gratitude. I read the block of aggressive texts while pouring myself a glass of imported sparkling water. The old me would have felt a familiar surge of anxiety, guilt, and the urge to defend myself. The new me simply felt a profound clinical pity for her delusion. I did not argue. I did not type out a long paragraph defending myself or explaining the tow truck. I simply typed a brief reply telling her to have a great cruise and reminding her not to forget to pay her credit card minimums. I hit send. Then I opened my phone settings and systematically blocked the phone numbers for Thomas, Barbara, Brittany, and Isaiah. I did the same on my email and social accounts. The digital wall was officially up. A deep, uninterrupted silence finally filled the room. I spent that night quietly packing a single suitcase with my most essential personal items, leaving my rundown furniture and cheap clothes behind for the landlord to deal with. The next morning, I woke up early and put on the sharpest, most expensive tailored suit I had ever owned, purchased during a quick stop the previous afternoon. I did not drive a rusty vehicle to work. I took a private black car service directly to my financial firm. I walked into the corporate building with my head held high, feeling the heavy weight of the daily grind slide completely off my shoulders. I bypassed my small cubicle entirely and headed straight to the Human Resources Department on the executive floor. I did not bring a standard 2-week notice letter. Instead, I dropped a devastating, highly detailed 80-page risk assessment report directly onto the Human Resources Director's desk. I had spent the last 6 months quietly and meticulously documenting my toxic managers, blatant data manipulations, unethical accounting practices, and aggressive verbal abuse toward junior staff. I looked the stunned director in the eye and told her that my formal resignation was effective immediately. I casually suggested that she might want to loop in the corporate legal department before the federal auditors took a closer look at our sector. I turned around and walked out of the plush office before she could even formulate a single word of response. I stepped out of the glass revolving doors and into the brisk Chicago morning air, carrying only a small cardboard box containing my favorite coffee mug and a few personal desk items. I was entirely untraceable, completely unburdened, and officially a multimillionaire with absolute control over my own destiny. I walked toward my waiting private car while my family remained totally oblivious to my evolution. They were boarding a luxury cruise ship built on a foundation of lies, still thinking I was the same miserable compliant scapegoat they had mocked at Thanksgiving dinner. They had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet was about to violently crumble. The $86 million officially settled into the Phoenix Trust accounts exactly 48 hours later. I did not immediately march into a luxury dealership to purchase a fleet of exotic sports cars or post cryptic triumphant messages online. I applied the exact same clinical risk assessment strategies to my sudden wealth that I applied to my corporate job. Using a newly formed Shell LLC, I quietly executed a cash purchase for a $6 million ultra-secure penthouse right in the heart of downtown Chicago. It was a fortress in the sky accessible only by a private elevator that required a biometric fingerprint scan to operate. I spent my first few days meticulously erasing my digital and physical footprint. As I stood in my expansive new living room, watching the city lights reflect off the dark waters of Lake Michigan, through floor-to-ceiling windows, my cell phone screen illuminated the darkened room. It was a rapid-fire strobe of furious text messages from Brittany. She was absolutely livid about the heavy-duty tow truck ruining our parents' meticulously manicured front lawn. In her mind, I had committed the ultimate act of treason, and her narcissism immediately took control. She demanded that I immediately come downtown to her apartment, deep clean it from top to bottom, and dog sit her 2 high-maintenance poodles entirely for free while she and Isaiah embarked on their $16,000 Mediterranean cruise. She stated that performing this massive favor was the absolute least I could do, since I clearly had no life of my own and owed the family a massive debt of gratitude for tolerating my existence. I did not argue or attempt to justify the tow truck incident. I simply typed a brief reply telling her to have a great cruise and reminding her not to forget to pay her credit card minimums. Before she could type a frantic response, I locked my screen. I opened my phone settings and systematically blocked the phone numbers for Thomas, Barbara, Brittany, and Isaiah. The digital fortress was finally sealed. I spent the remainder of that night ruthlessly packing only what truly mattered, leaving my cramped, run-down apartment completely empty. The next morning, I walked into my financial firm for the very last time. I bypassed the standard 2-week notice entirely and walked straight into the Human Resources Department. I dropped a devastating, highly detailed 80-page risk assessment report squarely on the director's desk. It was a meticulous compilation of irrefutable evidence exposing my toxic manager's blatant data manipulations and unethical accounting practices. I looked the stunned director in the eye, quit on the spot, and casually suggested she loop in the corporate legal team before federal auditors took a closer look at our sector. I walked out of the glass revolving doors and into the brisk Chicago morning air, completely untraceable, unburdened, and entirely free. While I was building my anonymous empire, the facade of my family's perfect life began to violently shatter. The perspective shift was almost poetic. Brittany and Isaiah were living a complete lie on the Mediterranean Sea, furiously posting heavily filtered photos of themselves sipping expensive champagne on the deck of their luxury cruise. They were projecting an image of flawless executive wealth. Back in Chicago, however, the devastating consequences of Thomas's arrogance finally caught up with him. His regional logistics company was abruptly hit with a brutal, unexpected financial audit by federal regulators. Men in dark suits walked into his corporate office and immediately seized the ledgers. Years of cooking the books, hiding deficits, and shifting imaginary profits were suddenly dragged out into the harsh light of day. Thomas's corporate bank accounts were instantly frozen, pending a massive federal investigation. The carefully constructed illusion of their wealthy suburban life began to crack right down the middle. Barbara descended into absolute panic over the frozen accounts. Desperate to maintain their lifestyle and save her husband from potential prison time, she drove straight to my old apartment building. She fully intended to batter down my door and physically demand that I drain my entire retirement savings to bail them out. Instead, she arrived to find my unit completely empty, with confused new tenants already carrying boxes through the front door. Standing in the dingy hallway, Barbara unleashed a barrage of increasingly vicious, unhinged voicemails onto my blocked number log. She screamed that I was a cold-blooded, ungrateful monster for abandoning my blood relatives in their darkest hour of need. I listened to her frantic screaming through the high-end Bluetooth speakers in my penthouse, calmly sipping a hot matcha latte as I watched the morning traffic flow through the city below. I did not reply. Halfway across the world, the ultimate trap finally sprang shut on the golden couple. Isaiah attempted to pay for a massive lavish dinner on the cruise ship using his primary black card. The waiter returned with a tight, polite smile, informing him the transaction had been declined. Isaiah, sweating slightly, pulled out a secondary card. It was also declined. He tried a third. Declined again. The devastating truth was that Isaiah's supposed crypto wealth did not exist. He had been secretly using Thomas's corporate accounts as a personal slush fund to finance his gambling habits and Brittany's designer lifestyle. With Thomas's accounts locked by federal auditors, the tap was completely dry. Brittany and Isaiah were stranded in Europe, entirely broke and facing imminent legal action from the cruise line for tens of thousands of dollars in unpaid luxury room upgrades and premium alcohol charges. Desperation obliterated Brittany's pride. Since her primary phone number was blocked, she acquired a cheap international burner phone to send me a frantic text message. She begged for an immediate $5,000 wire transfer just to purchase 2 economy tickets back to Chicago. She promised they would pay me back the second Isaiah's crypto portfolio bounced back. I read the frantic text message from the absolute comfort of my velvet sofa. I opened my Venmo application, typed in Brittany's username, and authorized a transfer for exactly $5. I attached a single brief note to the transaction. Buy yourselves a scratch-off ticket. Good luck. The ride back into the heart of Chicago inside the tinted sanctuary of the Uber Black was the quietest hour I had experienced in years. I watched the suburban sprawl fade into the rearview mirror, replaced by the towering concrete and steel canyons of the city. My phone rested silently in my lap. I knew my father was likely having an absolute aneurysm over his destroyed landscaping, but I had completely detached myself from his rage. By the time I walked through the doors of my cramped, drafty studio apartment, a highly encrypted notification appeared on my screen. It was a direct message from the senior partner at the wealth management firm. The massive wire transfer had officially bypassed all federal holds and cleared the final clearinghouse checks. $86 million was now sitting securely in the newly established Phoenix Trust corporate accounts. I sat at my tiny wobbly kitchen table and stared at the 9-digit figure glowing back at me. For a risk analyst, numbers are a language that tell a strict, uncompromising story. This particular string of numbers told a story of absolute invulnerability. Most people who fall into sudden extreme wealth immediately become their own worst enemies. They purchase neon-colored exotic sports cars they have no idea how to handle. They buy sprawling estates in gated communities filled with neighbors who despise new money. They broadcast their sudden windfalls across every social media platform, begging for validation and instantly painting giant targets on their own backs. I had spent my entire life watching my parents and my sister construct a suffocating, fragile house of cards based on exactly that kind of desperate visibility. I knew that the loudest people in the room were always the most vulnerable. I chose a completely different path. I chose to become a ghost. My first directive to the wealth management firm was strict and non-negotiable. My legal name was never to be associated with any public-facing asset. We immediately established a complex network of shell corporations nested within holding companies designed specifically to obscure ownership. Using one of these newly minted entities, I began the search for my sanctuary. I did not want a sprawling suburban mansion with a lawn that required a team of landscapers. I wanted an impenetrable fortress in the sky. Through a highly discreet real estate broker who catered exclusively to extreme high net worth clients, I located exactly what I needed. It was a $6 million penthouse occupying the entire top floor of a newly constructed ultra-luxury high-rise right in the downtown core. The purchasing process was entirely clinical and completely invisible. The transaction was executed in cash through the Shell LLC, meaning the deed and public tax records would only ever show a faceless corporate entity. When I took the private tour, I knew instantly that this was the exact environment I required. The architecture was sleek minimalist and defined by absolute security. The only way to access the 50th floor was through a dedicated private elevator. It required a physical proximity key fob, a rolling digital passcode generated every 60 seconds, and a biometric retinal scan just to make the car move upward. The elevator doors opened directly into a massive private foyer lined with imported black stone. Beyond the foyer, the main living space was breathtaking. The walls were constructed entirely of reinforced floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a stunning, uninterrupted 270-degree panoramic view of Lake Michigan and the sprawling city skyline. The airspace above the city was silent, isolated, and utterly peaceful. I bought the property on the spot without a second of hesitation. With my physical fortress secured, I immediately turned my attention to my digital and historical footprint. A risk analyst understands that personal information is a weapon, and my family was entirely too accustomed to weaponizing my personal details to locate me or harass me. I hired a boutique cybersecurity firm that usually protected corporate executives and politicians. Their singular mandate was to scrub my existence from the internet. Within 48 hours, my presence on data broker websites, public directories, and background check databases was systematically dismantled. I personally deleted every single social media account I had ever created, wiping out years of photographs, tags, and digital connections. I did not post a dramatic farewell message or hint at my new life. I simply vanished from the grid. Next, I tackled my physical ties to my old existence. I hired a specialized crew of premium movers to clear out my cheap studio apartment in the dead of night. I instructed them to donate the cheap furniture to a local charity and take the few boxes of my personal belongings directly to the heavily guarded service entrance of the new high-rise. I left my old landlord a cashier's check covering the remainder of my lease, along with a typed note stating I was vacating the premises immediately. I provided zero forwarding address. I closed my local bank accounts and transferred my meager original savings into a secure secondary account, entirely untethered from my past banking history. Every single string that connected me to the ground-level world where my family operated was being deliberately and permanently severed. I was methodically building a deep moat around my new life. The transition was exhausting, but intensely satisfying. I spent my first evening in the penthouse standing alone in the massive, empty living room. I had not even bothered to buy furniture yet. The vast space echoed slightly as I walked across the dark imported hardwood floors. The sun had just set, and the city of Chicago was coming alive beneath me. Millions of lights glittering in the freezing winter air spread out like a glowing electric grid. The freezing water of the lake was a solid wall of black against the eastern horizon. For the first time in my 29 years, I felt completely safe. I was suspended high above the noise, the endless manipulation, and the toxic expectations that had defined my entire childhood. The air up here was clean and thin. I stood close to the glass, holding a mug of hot tea, letting the profound silence wash over me. It was a moment of perfect, pristine isolation. Then the absolute stillness of the room was violently interrupted. A harsh, bright light flared against the dark glass reflection. My old cell phone, which I had placed on the granite kitchen island specifically to monitor any incoming fallout, was buzzing furiously. The screen lit up the shadows, throwing a harsh blue glow across the stone countertops. I did not need to walk over to read the screen to know exactly what was happening. The phone was vibrating in a continuous frantic strobe. The name flashing aggressively across the display was Brittany. The golden child had finally realized that my rusty car had destroyed our parents' pristine lawn, and the digital barrage of her unhinged fury had officially begun. The harsh blue light of my cell phone pulsed relentlessly against the dark polished stone of my kitchen island. It was vibrating so violently, it was slowly inching its way across the granite surface, threatening to drop off the edge. I stood perfectly still in the quiet expanse of my new penthouse, watching the name flash across the screen. Brittany. My sister had finally assessed the collateral damage of the mud-slicked crater I had left on our parents' front lawn, and she was now unleashing the full, unhinged force of her golden child fury. I did not feel the familiar clench of anxiety in my chest. I did not feel the desperate urge to rehearse a defensive apology. I simply reached out, picked up the vibrating device, and swiped my thumb across the screen to answer the call. I did not even say hello. I just brought the receiver to my ear and let the storm wash over me. Brittany did not wait for a greeting. She launched immediately into a breathless, high-pitched tirade that echoed loudly in the cavernous silence of my living room. She was screaming so loudly the audio slightly distorted through the tiny speaker. She demanded to know what kind of psychotic, jealous monster I was to pull a stunt like that right before the holidays. According to her, our mother was currently inside the house, hyperventilating on the antique sofa, requiring a cold compress because the aesthetic of her award-winning landscaping was irreparably destroyed. Brittany painted me as a deeply bitter failure, lashing out at a family that had only ever tried to support me. I listened to her frantic breathing, picturing her pacing around her expensive downtown loft, her face flushed with righteous indignation. It was a masterclass in narcissistic rage, but it was entirely predictable. I remained completely silent, allowing her to exhaust her initial wave of anger. Sure enough, within 60 seconds, the screaming abruptly morphed into something even more audacious. The sheer breathtaking magnitude of my sister's entitlement was a sight to behold. Having thoroughly berated me for my complete lack of respect, she seamlessly pivoted into a transactional demand. Her tone shifted from hysterical to dripping with absolute condescension. She informed me that in order to even begin making up for my horrible disrespect, I was now required to perform a massive favor. She and Isaiah were leaving the very next morning for a 2-week luxury cruise through the Mediterranean Sea. They had supposedly dropped $16,000 on this grand European adventure to celebrate Isaiah's brilliant crypto investments. Because they were so busy being successful, they had fired their usual pet sitter over a minor dispute and were now supposedly in a desperate bind. Brittany declared that I was going to come over to her high-rise apartment, clean the entire place from top to bottom, and dog-sit her two intensely high-maintenance, neurotically pampered poodles for the entire duration of their vacation. And I was going to do it completely for free. She did not frame this as a plea for help. She framed it as a mandatory penance. Her voice dripped with absolute disdain as she laid out the logistics. She instructed me on exactly what kind of organic artisan food to prepare for the dogs, and which specific luxury cleaning products I was allowed to use on her hardwood floors. She justified this insane mandate by stating it was the absolute least I could do for the family. In her exact words, I clearly had absolutely no life of my own, no real responsibilities, and no future to worry about. She laughed a sharp, mocking sound and told me that staying in her nice apartment might actually be a nice vacation from my pathetic, cramped little studio. She was offering me the privilege of serving her while she sailed the Mediterranean pretending to be royalty. She demanded that I be at her place by 6 o'clock the next morning to pick up the keys before their private car arrived to take them to the airport. She waited for my compliant, subservient response, the same eager-to-please submission she had extracted from me since we were children. I stood looking out the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my 50-story high fortress. The glittering expanse of downtown Chicago stretched out below me, a sea of golden lights against the pitch-black night. I held the phone to my ear, feeling the cool, smooth metal against my skin. The contrast between my new $86 million reality and her pathetic, demanding delusion was almost poetic. The old version of me, the sister who desperately craved their validation, would have stammered out an excuse or weakly tried to defend my boundaries. I would have engaged in a draining circular argument that left me exhausted and weeping. But that woman no longer existed. She had died the moment I signed the Phoenix Trust documents. I did not argue with Brittany. I did not attempt to explain my side of the story. I did not mention the tow truck, my new penthouse, or the fact that my net worth now eclipsed her wildest delusions of grandeur. I kept my voice perfectly flat, completely devoid of emotion or hesitation. I looked at the reflection of the city lights shimmering on the dark lake water and took a slow breath. "Have a great cruise," I said, the words slicing cleanly through the thick silence of the room. "Do not forget to pay your credit card minimums." Before she could draw breath to scream, before she could even process the absolute finality of my statement, I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button. The call ended with a sharp digital click. I did not wait for the inevitable barrage of frantic, aggressive text messages that were sure to follow. I opened my phone settings and navigated directly to my contact list. My hands did not shake. My heart rate remained completely steady. I tapped on Thomas's profile and hit block. I selected Barbara's number and hit block. I found Isaiah's contact and hit block. Finally, I selected Brittany's name and permanently blocked her number from ever reaching my device again. The digital wall was officially up, solid and impenetrable. I tossed the silenced phone onto the granite counter. A deep, profound quiet settled over the penthouse. The strings of control were completely severed, and I was finally entirely free. The drive back to the city was a quiet transition from the chaotic, mud-slicked disaster I had left behind to the cold, calculated future I was actively building. The sleek black SUV dropped me off a block away from my old apartment building. The brisk Chicago wind whipped down the narrow, dimly lit street as I walked the remaining distance. My drafty studio apartment felt even smaller and more suffocating than usual when I unlocked the deadbolt and stepped inside. The ancient radiator hissed and clanked in the corner, acting as a harsh, metallic reminder of the miserable financial anxiety I was finally leaving behind. I did not waste time feeling nostalgic. I grabbed two large, heavy-duty trash bags from under the sink and began the methodical process of completely erasing my physical existence from the space. I packed only the absolute essentials into a single sleek carry-on suitcase. Important identification documents, a few tailored professional suits, and my laptop. Everything else was completely disposable. The cheap particle board furniture, the worn-out clothes, the faded area rug, they all stayed exactly where they were. I filled the trash bags with any mail bills or lingering paperwork that bore my name and carried them directly down to the alley dumpster. I scrubbed the surfaces, wiped down the counters, and left the apartment key sitting squarely on the kitchen island alongside a cashier's check covering my lease termination fee. By 2 in the morning, the vanishing act was complete. I walked out of the building without looking back and hailed a cab to my new sanctuary in the sky. I woke up the next morning in the silent, flawless expanse of my penthouse. Today was the day I severed the final remaining tether to my old identity. I showered and dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that projected absolute unyielding authority. It was not the attire of a subservient risk analyst, desperate to keep her job and please her superiors. It was the armor of a woman who held all the cards. I took a private car service to the financial district, watching the city wake up around me through tinted windows. The towering glass facade of the corporate building, where I had spent years grinding away for ungrateful executives, loomed ahead. I walked through the revolving doors and merged with the stream of anxious, over-caffeinated employees rushing to their cubicles. I felt no anxiety. I felt only cold anticipation. I stepped off the elevator on the 40th floor, but I did not turn left toward the maze of analyst workstations. Instead, I turned right and walked straight through the heavy glass doors of the Human Resources Department. The executive floor was hushed and intimidating, designed specifically to make lower-level employees feel small and insignificant. I bypassed the receptionist who called out my name in shock and walked directly into the office of the Human Resources Director. She was a stern, humorless woman who immediately demanded to know why I was interrupting her morning without a scheduled appointment. I did not apologize. I stood in front of her massive mahogany desk and dropped a thick, heavy, professionally bound folder directly onto her keyboard. The loud, heavy thud echoed sharply in the quiet office. I looked her dead in the eye and told her she needed to cancel her morning meetings because the firm was facing a catastrophic liability. The folder was a devastating, highly detailed 80-page risk assessment report that I had spent the last 3 months secretly compiling on my own time. It was a flawless, irrefutable paper trail exposing my direct manager. I laid out exactly how he had been blatantly manipulating quarterly data sets to artificially inflate our sector projections and secure massive performance bonuses for himself. I had meticulously documented his unethical accounting practices, his aggressive verbal abuse toward junior staff, and his deliberate falsification of risk models. I explained to the director that the evidence was completely airtight and perfectly formatted for a federal auditor to review. Her face drained of all color as she flipped open the cover and scanned the first executive summary page. She stammered, asking me if I was fully aware of the magnitude of these explosive allegations. I kept my voice perfectly flat and devoid of emotion. I told her they were not allegations, they were documented facts. I then informed her that I was not there to negotiate a transfer or file a grievance. I was there to inform her that my formal resignation was effective immediately. The standard 2-week notice period was a professional courtesy reserved for employers who did not foster fraudulent and hostile work environments. I handed her my corporate access badge and my company-issued security fob. I casually suggested that she might want to loop in the corporate legal department before the end of the business day. I turned around and walked out of the plush office before she could even formulate a single word of response. The entire exchange took less than 5 minutes, but it effectively burned the bridge to my old, undervalued identity straight to the ground. I walked back out onto the main floor and headed toward my old cubicle. The toxic manager in question was standing near my desk, his face purple with rage, demanding to know where I had been all morning. He started shouting a string of aggressive orders, but his voice simply bounced off me like rain on a windshield. I did not engage. I did not even look at him. I picked up a small cardboard box I had prepared the day before. It contained only my favorite ceramic coffee mug, a silver pen, and a small framed print. That was the entirety of my corporate legacy. I tucked the box securely under my arm, walked right past my screaming manager, and stepped into the descending elevator. The doors slid shut, cutting off his voice completely. I walked out of the corporate building and stepped into the brisk Chicago air. The freezing wind whipped through my hair, but I felt incredibly warm. I was a completely free, untraceable multimillionaire, while my family remained entirely oblivious to my evolution. While I stepped into the brisk Chicago air, a completely free and untraceable multimillionaire, my family remained entirely oblivious to my evolution. 4,000 miles away, basking in the artificial glow of the Mediterranean sun, the illusion they had spent decades building was beginning to fray at the edges. The perspective shift was a masterclass in irony. Aboard a luxury cruise liner, a floating palace of excess, Brittany and Isaiah were working tirelessly to project an image of absolute perfection. They were sailing through some of the most beautiful waters on Earth, but they were not actually enjoying the experience. For my sister, the European vacation was nothing more than a rigorous, exhausting photo shoot designed specifically to incite envy among her social circle. She spent her days aggressively curating a false reality. Brittany commandeered the premium VIP lounging deck, demanding that the waitstaff constantly reposition her silver ice bucket because it was casting an unacceptable shadow on her designer sunglasses. She ordered bottles of impossibly expensive champagne, taking tiny, careful sips, while forcing Isaiah to take hundreds of photos from very specific low angles to make her legs look longer. Every smile was calculated. Every candid laugh was meticulously rehearsed. She spent hours applying heavy digital filters to the images before uploading them to her feeds, accompanied by obnoxious hashtags boasting about crypto wealth, being a blessed executive wife, and living a life of limitless abundance. Underneath the glossy filters and the carefully curated social media posts, however, their reality was rapidly rotting from the inside out. Isaiah sat across from her on the sun-drenched deck, sweating profusely through his expensive linen shirt. His eyes were glued to his cell phone screen in a state of absolute silent terror. He was not admiring the crystal blue waters of the Amalfi Coast or enjoying the gentle sea breeze. He was frantically refreshing a digital wallet application that displayed a balance of absolute zero. The brilliant, highly lucrative crypto emergency he had claimed to be dealing with back in Chicago was actually a total catastrophic liquidation. His speculative investments had flatlined months ago, leaving him drowning in silent debt. To fund this luxurious excursion and keep Brittany blissfully ignorant of his massive failures, Isaiah had quietly tethered his escalating expenses to a corporate credit line he had secretly siphoned from my father's business. He was swiping a heavy metal black card that belonged entirely to Thomas' logistics firm, praying with every transaction that the authorizations would continue to clear long enough for him to formulate a backup plan. They were a fragile house of cards floating aimlessly on the ocean. Meanwhile, back in the freezing suburbs of Chicago, the architect of this entire dysfunctional empire was sitting in his sprawling corner office, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet was about to give way. Thomas operated his regional logistics company from a sleek, glass-fronted building designed specifically to intimidate. His personal office featured heavy mahogany furniture, imported leather chairs, and a massive wall of windows looking down on his loading docks and warehouse fleet. He spent his mornings barking aggressive orders at terrified middle managers and admiring his own reflection in the glass. He believed he was an untouchable titan of industry. He believed his wealth was an impenetrable armor that made him inherently superior to everyone else in his orbit. Thomas was completely blind to his own vulnerability because the foundation of his company was built on highly illegal sand. For nearly a decade, he had been aggressively and sloppily cooking the books. He routinely inflated his quarterly profit margins to secure massive unearned bank loans. He created elaborate ghost accounts to hide catastrophic operational deficits and regularly shifted restricted corporate funds into his personal checking accounts to pay for Barbara's country club memberships and Brittany's extravagant lifestyle. He viewed federal tax regulations and financial compliance laws as mere suggestions meant only for smaller, weaker men. He had operated with absolute impunity for so long that he genuinely believed he was invincible. The brutal reality check arrived just before his scheduled lunch hour. Thomas was in the middle of verbally berating an exhausted account manager over the speakerphone when the heavy glass doors of his executive suite swung open without a single knock. It was not his terrified secretary bringing him fresh coffee or a subordinate looking for a signature. It was a highly coordinated team of federal forensic auditors, flanked by stern-faced legal counsel. They did not announce their presence with pleasantries or wait to be acknowledged. They walked directly to his massive mahogany desk, flashed their federal credentials, and handed him a thick, heavy stack of executed search warrants. The lead auditor, a woman with a flat, uncompromising expression, informed Thomas that his firm was the subject of an immediate, comprehensive financial audit. She stated clearly that every physical ledger, every hard drive, every corporate server, and every filing cabinet in the building was being seized for forensic inspection. Thomas' face drained of all color. The arrogant sneer he wore like a second skin vanished instantly, replaced by genuine, unadulterated panic. He stood up, puffing out his chest, attempting to use his sheer physical presence to intimidate them out of his office. He shouted loud, aggressive threats, demanding to speak to his lawyers and claiming they had absolutely no right to interrupt his daily operations. The auditors simply ignored his blustering. They moved with terrifying clinical precision, bypassing his desk and plugging external encrypted hard drives directly into his secure network servers. Thomas watched in absolute breathless horror as the digital files he had spent years burying deep within nested hidden folders were systematically extracted. The fake shipping manifests, the offshore wire transfers, the personal expenses disguised as operational fleet costs, all of it was bleeding rapidly into the harsh, unforgiving light. The dark secrets he had guarded so fiercely were being laid bare in real time. Desperation clawed at his throat. He reached for his office phone to call his primary bank, desperate to move his liquid assets into secondary accounts before the auditors could lock them down. He punched in the direct line to his private wealth manager, his hands shaking so violently he misdialed twice. He slammed the receiver down when he reached an automated recording and frantically grabbed his computer mouse to log directly into his desktop banking portal. His eyes widened in absolute terror as the screen slowly loaded. The large, comforting numbers that usually greeted him were completely gone. In their place was a glaring bright red notification banner warning him that his access was denied. Thomas' corporate bank accounts, lines of credit, and operational funds had been abruptly and completely frozen by federal auditors. The impenetrable facade of their wealthy, flawless suburban life began to violently crack. Miles away from the federal raid that was currently dismantling her husband's fraudulent empire, Barbara was enjoying a late-morning deep-tissue massage at her exclusive country club. Her phone rang from inside her designer tote bag with a frantic, aggressive cadence. When she finally snatched it up and answered, Thomas did not offer his usual arrogant greeting. He was hyperventilating heavily, gasping out fragmented, terrified sentences about federal auditors' frozen assets and impending grand jury indictments. He told her the corporate accounts were completely locked out and the personal accounts were officially red-flagged by the government. They had absolutely zero access to their cash, and the walls were rapidly closing in. The blood drained entirely from Barbara's face as the catastrophic reality of his panicked ramblings set in. Her immediate reflex was not to comfort her terrified husband or to face the legal consequences of their lavish, illicit lifestyle. Her instinct, as always, was to find a convenient scapegoat and an immediate financial lifeline. Since Brittany was currently entirely inaccessible on a luxury yacht in the Mediterranean, squandering money they technically no longer possessed, Barbara immediately targeted her youngest daughter. In her warped, highly transactional reality, Paige was not an independent adult, but a walking emergency fund. Paige had always been responsible, boringly frugal, and reliably employed at a steady corporate job. Barbara convinced herself that Paige must have accumulated a substantial retirement account over the years. She decided right then and there that Paige was going to drain her entire 401k hand over every single cent of cash and save her father from federal prison. It was not going to be a request, it was a parental mandate. Barbara stormed out of the country club spa, leaving her esthetician completely bewildered mid-treatment. She threw her luxury SUV into gear and sped aggressively toward the city limits. Her mind raced with righteous indignation as she entirely fabricated a narrative where Paige owed them this ultimate sacrifice. She practiced the exact tone of guilt, inducing authority, she would use the moment her daughter opened the door. She navigated the downtown traffic with erratic, dangerous swerves, her manic desperation growing with every mile. She finally arrived at the neighborhood she had always openly despised, viewing the modest apartment buildings as a personal insult to her high standards. She parked her massive vehicle illegally in a loading zone, completely indifferent to the tow warning signs. She marched into the drafty lobby of my old building, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the cheap linoleum floor. She ignored the peeling paint on the walls and the flickering fluorescent lights, marching directly to the third floor with the singular focus of a woman ready to batter down a door and demand absolute obedience. Reaching the familiar scratched door of the cramped studio, Barbara did not bother to knock politely. She balled her hand into a tight fist and pounded heavily against the cheap wood, demanding that I open up immediately. She yelled loudly through the hallway that it was a massive family emergency and that there was no time for any dramatic nonsense. She waited expectantly, anticipating the familiar sound of the deadbolt sliding back and the sight of my resigned, compliant face. Instead, the door swung open to reveal a tall, bearded man in a backwards baseball cap holding a heavy cardboard box of kitchen supplies. A young woman stood right behind him, unwrapping a cheap plastic floor lamp. The apartment behind them was completely different. The walls had been freshly painted a sterile white, and unfamiliar, mismatched furniture was scattered haphazardly across the small space. Barbara stared at the couple in absolute stunned silence. She aggressively demanded to know what they were doing inside her daughter's apartment. The man exchanged a highly confused look with his partner before politely explaining that they had just signed a 12-month lease and were officially moving in today. The previous tenant had apparently vacated the premises entirely days ago, breaking her lease, paying the penalty in cash, and leaving absolutely no forwarding address. The realization hit Barbara like a physical blow to the chest. She tried to peer past the strangers, looking for any sign of my old cheap rug or my boring coffee table, but the space was completely void of my existence. The apartment was entirely empty of her safety net. The new tenants gently closed the door, leaving Barbara standing completely alone in the dim, drafty hallway. The absolute impossibility of the situation fractured her remaining shreds of composure. Her chest heaved as she pulled out her phone, her hands trembling with a toxic mixture of mounting terror and white-hot fury. She dialed my number, gripping the device so tightly, her knuckles turned white. The call went straight to a digital redirect. The automated tone indicating she had been permanently blocked did not even register in her manic, unhinged state. She waited for the beep and unleashed a string of increasingly vicious, frantic messages. She screamed into the phone, her voice echoing harshly off the cheap plaster walls of the empty corridor. She demanded that I stop playing these stupid, childish games immediately. She shrieked that her father was facing federal charges, and that I was strictly required to drain my accounts right now to save him from jail. With every unanswered call, her vitriol escalated into pure venom. She paced the narrow hallway, leaving a final, breathless voicemail screaming that I was a cold-blooded, ungrateful monster for abandoning my own flesh and blood in our ultimate time of need. She cursed my selfishness and demanded I call her back the exact second I received the message. High above the panic and the crumbling ruins of my family's fraudulent empire, the air was perfectly still. I sat cross-legged on a plush velvet sofa in the center of my expansive living room. The reinforced floor-to-ceiling glass offered a serene panoramic view of the cold gray waters of Lake Michigan. The penthouse was a fortress of pristine, absolute tranquility, completely insulated from the frantic vibrations of the ground-level world. I had synchronized my blocked voicemails to route directly into a secure digital cloud folder. The audio files were currently streaming effortlessly through the high-end invisible Bluetooth speakers embedded in the ceiling. Barbara's hysterical, shrieking voice filled the quiet room, echoing slightly against the imported black stone foyer. She called me a monster. She demanded my life savings to rescue a man who had built his fortune entirely on lies and theft. I listened to the frantic, unhinged voicemails with detached, clinical fascination. I held a warm ceramic mug between my hands, taking a slow, calm sip of a freshly whisked matcha latte. The rich, earthy flavor grounded me entirely in the present moment. The screaming eventually cut off, leaving only the soft hum of the climate control system. I set the mug down on the glass table. I did not reach for my phone. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I simply let the beautiful silence return, and I did not reply. While Barbara was screaming into the void in a drafty Chicago hallway 4,000 miles away, the other half of my family's fraudulent empire was experiencing its own spectacular slow-motion collapse. The Mediterranean air was unseasonably warm, carrying the faint salty scent of the sea across the upper observation deck of the luxury cruise liner. Brittany and Isaiah were seated at the absolute center of the ship's premier reservations-only dining room, a magnificent glass-enclosed space offering breathtaking panoramic views of the starlit ocean. They had just finished consuming a feast designed entirely for the purpose of conspicuous aggressive consumption. They had ordered beluga caviar gold leaf-dusted Wagyu beef and 2 bottles of a ridiculously rare vintage Bordeaux. Brittany was intensely focused on her phone, adjusting the brightness and saturation on her latest selfie, completely oblivious to the cold, prickling sweat that was rapidly gathering at the nape of her husband's neck. The meticulously dressed sommelier approached their table, presenting a sleek leather billfold with a discreet, practiced bow. Isaiah, maintaining his carefully constructed posture of a seasoned, untouchable crypto millionaire, casually slipped the heavy black corporate card into the leather flap without even bothering to glance at the total. He took a slow, confident sip of his imported sparkling water, waiting for the smooth, deferential return of the receipt so he could add an ostentatious tip. Instead, the ship's maitre d' appeared beside their table 5 minutes later. His face was a perfect mask of uncomfortable, rigid professional courtesy. He leaned down, whispering quietly that there seemed to be a slight, unexpected issue with the primary method of payment. The card had been declined. Isaiah scoffed loudly, playing the part of a deeply inconvenienced aristocrat. He blamed a hyperactive fraud alert triggered by international travel, and confidently produced a secondary platinum card from his designer wallet. It was another line of credit secretly and illegally tethered to Thomas's logistics firm. The maitre d' vanished, only to return much faster this time, declined. The blood rushed to Isaiah's face, a hot flush of genuine panic breaking through his arrogant facade. He pulled out a third card, a personal one that had been heavily maxed out months ago, silently praying for a glitch in the global banking matrix. Denied. The sheer, suffocating terror he had been suppressing since earlier that afternoon finally broke through his carefully maintained veneer. The federal freeze on Thomas's accounts was absolute, instantaneous, and uncompromising. The limitless stolen slush fund was officially dead. The situation deteriorated with terrifying, humiliating speed. The dining room manager subtly but firmly escorted them away from the gawking elite guests and directly down into the ship's security and financial office. The cruise line's chief purser sat behind a heavy metal desk, holding a printed ledger that unrolled like a scroll of absolute doom. Brittany and Isaiah had not just been enjoying the standard inclusive amenities, they had relentlessly and recklessly abused their room charge privileges from the moment they stepped aboard. They had booked private helicopter excursions at various ports of call, reserved VIP cabanas, demanded daily in-room champagne service, and indulged in hours of premium spa treatments. The accumulated balance was staggering, and the ship's management was no longer offering complimentary smiles. Isaiah frantically tried to access his banking applications, watching the little digital loading wheels spin endlessly before returning zero balances and severe red-lettered locked account warnings. Brittany's arrogant indignation rapidly morphed into a shrill, high-pitched panic as she realized they were not going to charm their way out of the brightly lit office. The purser informed them with absolute chilling clarity that if the outstanding balance of $22,000 was not settled immediately, they would not be permitted to disembark at their final destination in Greece. Instead, they would be confined to a holding cabin and handed directly over to local maritime authorities for the international theft of services. They were entirely stranded, completely broke, and staring directly down the barrel of a foreign legal nightmare. Back in Chicago, the sun was fully rising over Lake Michigan, casting a brilliant clear light across the reinforced glass of my penthouse. The silence in my living room was pristine and profoundly comforting. I was still standing by the kitchen island, holding my warm matcha latte, watching the city traffic move silently far below me. The tranquility was abruptly punctuated by a single sharp chime from a secondary monitoring application on my encrypted tablet. It was an international text message originating from a temporary burner number desperately bypassing the permanent blocks I had placed on their primary phones. The message was a chaotic, rambling block of text completely stripped of its usual condescending entitlement. It was Brittany reduced to absolute pathetic begging. The golden child was in a state of blind panic, her pristine European fantasy shattered into a million sharp pieces. She wildly explained that there had been a massive, terrifying banking error, that Isaiah's accounts were somehow frozen, and that they were physically trapped on the ship facing imminent arrest by Greek authorities. The arrogant demand of a free mandatory dog sitter had vanished entirely, replaced by a desperate groveling plea for an immediate emergency wire transfer. She was begging me for exactly $5,000 just to buy 2 basic last-minute economy tickets back to Chicago before the local police intervened. I read the frantic, grammatically incorrect paragraph twice, savoring the spectacular, absolute reversal of fortune. I did not feel a single flicker of pity or familial obligation. I set my ceramic mug down on the cool granite counter and calmly opened the Venmo application on my secure phone. I navigated to the payment screen and manually entered the international burner number. In the payment amount field, I did not type 5,000. I slowly and deliberately typed the number 5. Exactly $5.00. In the designated memo line, I kept my message perfectly concise, stripping away any trace of emotion. I attached a single note to the payment: "Buy yourselves a scratch-off ticket. Good luck." I tapped the confirm button, locked the screen of my phone, and turned back to watch the quiet, glittering city below, letting the ultimate absolute irony set in. I tapped the confirm button, locked the screen of my phone, and turned back to watch the quiet, glittering city below, letting the ultimate absolute irony set in. The sheer finality of that $5 transfer felt like closing a heavy, impenetrable vault door on my past. I watched the traffic crawling along Lakeshore Drive, my mind shifting from the immediate satisfaction of Brittany's humiliation to a colder, more analytical curiosity. Thomas was an arrogant, deeply corrupt man, but he was also incredibly paranoid and meticulously controlling. He had managed to keep his highly illegal accounting practices hidden from federal regulators and aggressive tax authorities for nearly a decade. The sudden catastrophic speed of the raid and the absolute depletion of his assets did not align with his usual careful, albeit fraudulent bookkeeping. A house of cards, that massive, usually takes time to collapse unless someone actively pulls out the primary foundation. I wanted to know exactly who pulled the card. My newfound wealth afforded me access to a tier of professionals who existed entirely in the shadows of the corporate world, operating far beyond the reach of standard private eyes. I reached out to an elite boutique intelligence firm based in a sleek, unmarked building in downtown Chicago. They specialized in forensic accounting, digital asset tracing, deep web financial reconstruction, and high-stakes corporate espionage. I retained their lead investigator, a sharp, relentlessly thorough man named Arthur, who operated with absolute clinical discretion. I gave him a single, unrestricted mandate, backed by an open-ended retainer. I wanted a complete granular autopsy of Thomas's logistics firm. I needed to understand the precise mechanical failure that triggered the federal audit, and drained the corporate accounts dry before the government even walked through the door. For 3 weeks, Arthur and his highly specialized team methodically tore apart the digital ghosts of my father's empire. They traced offshore wire transfers, decrypted nested hidden ledgers, and followed the bleeding money through a complex labyrinth of shell companies. When Arthur finally requested an in-person meeting at my penthouse, his voice over the secure line held a rare note of genuine professional shock. He arrived precisely on time, carrying a heavy combination locked leather briefcase. We sat across from each other in my sun-drenched living room, the cold gray expanse of Lake Michigan serving as a stark backdrop to the absolute financial bloodbath he was about to lay out on my glass coffee table. Arthur did not mince words or soften the blow. He opened his briefcase and laid out a series of high-resolution printed flowcharts, banking manifests, and encrypted server logs. The federal raid, he explained methodically, was a direct consequence of massive, unexplainable hemorrhaging from the company's restricted operational funds. The federal government had been alerted by a sudden series of reckless high-volume wire transfers that triggered automatic money laundering alarms at multiple banking institutions. But Thomas, for all his hubris, had not initiated those specific fatal transfers. Arthur pulled out a separate, thinner red file and slid it across the glass toward me. It contained the absolute, unvarnished truth about Isaiah, the brilliant, highly lucrative crypto startup that Isaiah constantly bragged about, the one that supposedly funded Britney's extensive designer wardrobe and their flawless luxury lifestyle, was a complete fabrication. It had never existed. There were no revolutionary digital assets, no proprietary blockchain algorithms, and no wealthy Silicon Valley investors. It was nothing more than a registered shell corporation, equipped with a cheap templated website and a rented virtual office address, meant to provide a flimsy veneer of legitimacy. The reality was far more pathetic and incredibly destructive. Isaiah was suffering from a massive, escalating, and completely out of control gambling addiction. He had been quietly hemorrhaging money on offshore sports betting syndicates and high-stakes underground tables for years. When his personal debt reached a critical life-threatening mass, he had desperately scoured his father-in-law's business for a lifeline. In doing so, he had discovered a quiet backdoor into Thomas's heavily manipulated accounting software. Because Thomas had built his entire company on highly illegal sand, utilizing ghost accounts and untraceable ledgers to hide his own corporate theft, he had inadvertently created the perfect dark environment for a parasite to thrive undetected. Isaiah had exploited this massive vulnerability with terrifying, desperate efficiency. For 36 consecutive months, my smug, arrogant brother-in-law had been systematically embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from Thomas's primary logistics firm. He siphoned the money in carefully calculated increments, expertly disguising the theft as routine operational fleet costs, inflated fuel expenditures, and phantom vendor payments. He funneled the stolen cash directly through his fake crypto startup, laundering the corporate funds to pay off his aggressive, threatening gambling bookies, and to finance Britney's relentless, unquenchable thirst for designer handbags, luxury cars, and five-star European vacations. The irony was suffocating. Britney had been parading around the Mediterranean, aggressively boasting about her limitless crypto wealth on social media, entirely funded by money. Her own husband was actively stealing from her father's illegal stash. Isaiah had completely drained the company's liquid reserves to absolute zero, triggering the bank alarms and pushing Thomas's already fragile, fraudulent ecosystem past the point of no return. The sheer audacity of the betrayal was staggering. Arthur watched me silently process the overwhelming influx of information, his expression a mask of grim, respectful courtesy. He reached into his leather briefcase one final time and withdrew a thick, heavy black physical ledger. It was a complete, meticulously documented reconstruction of Isaiah's theft, tracking every single stolen cent from Thomas's corporate accounts directly to the offshore bookies and the luxury fashion boutiques. Arthur placed the heavy book directly into my hands. The leather felt cold and substantial against my palms. As I opened the cover and stared at the undeniable, damning columns of stolen numbers, the final explosive piece of the puzzle snapped perfectly into place. Isaiah was not just a pathetic, lying parasite floating aimlessly on a broken luxury yacht. He was the literal, undeniable architect of Thomas and Barbara's total financial ruin. The heavy black ledger resting on my glass coffee table was a monument to their destruction, and across the city, the reality of that destruction was finally crashing down on my father. Sitting in the sterile conference room of his high-priced defense attorney Thomas was forced to review the exact same financial autopsy my private investigator had just delivered to me. His lawyers laid out the undeniable paper trail, proving that his catastrophic downfall was an inside job. Thomas stared at the printed manifest detailing Isaiah's fake crypto startup and the millions of dollars systematically siphoned to offshore gambling syndicates. The realization that he had been outsmarted and bankrupted by his own hand-picked son-in-law, a man he had constantly praised as a financial prodigy, shattered the remnants of his towering ego. He had spent years lecturing me about the brutality of the business world, only to be gutted by the parasite he had enthusiastically welcomed into his own family. The fury that consumed him was absolute, but it was completely useless. The federal government was already dismantling his logistics firm piece by piece, and the collateral damage was spreading rapidly. With his corporate assets frozen by federal auditors and his illegal slush funds completely evaporated, Thomas could no longer mask the massive operational deficits he had accumulated over the years. The domino effect was immediate and ruthless. The primary bank holding the mortgages on their lavish suburban estate received automatic notification of the federal grand jury indictments. Acting with swift corporate self-preservation, the bank instantly called in the massive outstanding loans that Thomas had secured using highly fraudulent revenue projections. The foreclosure notices were drafted, printed, and delivered by certified courier directly to the heavy oak front door of their pristine colonial mansion. The impenetrable fortress of wealth that Barbara had spent decades obsessively curating was officially the property of the bank. They had mere days to vacate before the physical eviction was enforced, and their spectacular disgrace became public record. Desperation is a powerful catalyst for delusion. Stripped of his power, facing imminent prison time, and dealing with a wife who was oscillating dangerously between manic rage and catatonia, Thomas exhausted every single one of his wealthy country club associates. Nobody was willing to touch a man radioactive with federal tax evasion and wire fraud charges. Out of options and running out of hours, he finally turned his attention to his discarded scapegoat. Barbara had already reported her catastrophic failure at my old apartment, revealing that I had vanished without a trace, breaking my lease and leaving no forwarding address. Thomas resorted to searching the digital landscape. Sitting alone in the dark shadows of his foreclosed mansion, he obsessively scoured the internet looking for any thread that might lead to my current location. He eventually typed my name into a professional networking platform. My profile loaded on his glowing screen, presenting a crisp professional headshot and a completely updated employment history. His bloodshot eyes scanned the page, locking onto my current title. It read, Chief Executive Officer at Phoenix Holdings. For a man fundamentally incapable of recognizing my competence, the title simply did not compute. His deeply ingrained arrogance immediately went to work rewriting reality to fit his warped worldview. He convinced himself that Phoenix Holdings must be some obscure mid-level firm, and that my title was merely an inflated vanity plate handed out by a much wealthier, unseen superior. In his mind, I was still the boring, underachieving disappointment playing dress-up in the corporate world. He assumed I had somehow managed to land a respectable administrative role, working for an incredibly rich private equity firm. He did not care about my success. He only cared about the capital my supposed employer possessed. He saw a lifeline, an opportunity to exploit my proximity to actual wealth. He dialed the contact number listed on the public directory of Phoenix Holdings, a line that routed directly to my secure executive voicemail. The message he left was a masterpiece of cognitive dissonance, blending his usual demanding parental authority with the thinly veiled desperation of a drowning man. He did not bother to ask how I was doing or apologize for the years of emotional neglect. He immediately launched into a sanitized, highly distorted version of his current legal nightmare, claiming he was the victim of a slight temporary liquidity crisis caused by a misunderstanding with the federal government. He then issued his demand. He ordered me to march into my new boss's office and leverage my position to arrange an immediate corporate buyout of his debt. He proposed that Phoenix Holdings acquire his failing logistics firm at a steep discount, framing it as a highly lucrative acquisition for my superiors. He promised that this massive injection of cash would save our family from public humiliation and keep him out of federal prison. He ended the message by sternly reminding me that family loyalty was paramount and that he expected me to call him back with a confirmed meeting time by the end of the day. The audio file finished playing on my secure laptop, leaving a profound, heavy silence in my penthouse office. I sat back in my imported leather chair, letting the sheer magnitude of his delusion wash over me. He genuinely believed he was still holding the cards, still directing the narrative, still pulling the strings of his obedient, disappointed daughter. He was begging his own child to act as a subservient middleman to an imaginary boss, completely unaware that the vast, impenetrable corporate entity he was desperately trying to court was entirely mine. I reached out and snapped my laptop shut, the sharp click echoing through the vast room. A slow, razor-sharp smile spread across my face. The absolute perfect trap had been set, and the fish had practically thrown itself onto the hook. I picked up my phone and pressed the direct line to my lead corporate counsel. The phone rang once before my attorney answered. I kept my voice perfectly flat, devoid of any emotion other than absolute calculated business precision. I instructed my legal team to draft the preliminary acquisition paperwork and arrange a formal face-to-face meeting with Thomas at his earliest convenience. It was finally time to buy the ruins of my family. 48 hours later, the meticulous arrangements were complete. The architectural marvel of the Phoenix Holdings corporate headquarters pierced the Chicago skyline, a towering monolith of steel and dark reflective glass that dominated the financial district. On the 50th floor, the elevator doors slid open with a soft, expensive chime depositing the shattered remains of my family into a sprawling, immaculate reception area. The contrast between the environment and the new arrivals was stark and completely unforgiving. Thomas led the procession, though his usual aggressive stride had devolved into a nervous, rigid march. His bespoke suit, which normally fit him like armor, hung slightly loose over his frame, betraying the rapid weight loss caused by absolute panic. Barbara trailed closely behind him, clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver. Her face was a strained, pallid mask stripped of its usual haughty suburban superiority. But the most spectacular display of misery belonged to Brittany and Isaiah. They had miraculously made it back from the Mediterranean, but the journey had stripped them of every ounce of their curated glamour. Forced to use the pathetic $5 wire transfer combined with whatever loose change and severely overdrawn secondary accounts they could scrounge, they had endured a grueling 30-hour multi-layover journey entirely in deep economy. They had been crammed into middle seats near the rear lavatories, unable to afford lounge access or even decent airport food. Brittany's silk travel outfit was deeply wrinkled and stained, her hair pulled back into a messy, unwashed knot. She looked hollowed out, her eyes red-rimmed from crying across 3 different time zones. Isaiah looked even worse. The fake crypto titan was physically shaking, sweating profusely through a shirt that smelled faintly of stale airplane cabin air and profound fear. A sleek, impeccably dressed receptionist escorted the dysfunctional quartet down a long corridor, paneled in rich mahogany and modern art, leading them into the primary executive boardroom. It was a massive corner suite, encased entirely in floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a dizzying, godlike view of the city and the lake. A massive slab of polished black marble served as the conference table, surrounded by minimalist leather chairs. The receptionist offered them chilled, sparkling water in crystal glasses, informed them that the chief executive officer would join them shortly, and silently glided out of the room, closing the heavy frosted glass door behind her. The moment they were completely sealed inside the soundproof aquarium, the fragile truce shattered. Thomas rounded on his son-in-law with a sudden vicious intensity. He slammed his hands down on the black marble, leaning in so close that Isaiah physically recoiled. Thomas hissed through gritted teeth, his voice shaking with pure, unadulterated venom. He commanded Isaiah to keep his mouth completely shut during the upcoming negotiation. Thomas had only recently uncovered the full catastrophic extent of Isaiah's gambling embezzlement, realizing too late that the man he had praised as a financial genius was actually the parasite who had hollowed out his logistics firm from the inside. The only reason Thomas had even allowed Isaiah into the building was to present a unified, compliant family front to the mysterious billionaire they were about to beg for mercy. Thomas threatened that if Isaiah breathed a single word about the fake crypto startup or the stolen funds, he would personally hand the embezzlement ledgers over to the federal prosecutors the second they left the building. Isaiah shrank back into his leather chair, nodding rapidly, his arrogant swagger entirely eradicated. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand, terrified of both his father-in-law and the impending legal ruin. Brittany let out a loud, dramatic sob, burying her face in her hands. She whined miserably about her ruined vacation, complaining that she was starving, exhausted, and utterly traumatized by flying in coach. She demanded to know why they were relying on my supposed mid-level manager position to secure this meeting, expressing her utter disgust that their survival hinged on calling in a favor from the sister she had spent a lifetime mocking. Barbara snapped at her youngest daughter, her voice sharp and brittle. She ordered Brittany to pull herself together immediately, demanding that she fix her ruined makeup and at least attempt to look like a respectable executive wife. Barbara was in pure survival mode, ruthlessly focused on the grift. She turned her attention back to Thomas, her eyes wide with frantic calculation. They had to get their story absolutely straight before the CEO walked through the door. They huddled together around one end of the massive marble table, a pathetic circle of conspirators planning their final desperate illusion. Thomas outlined the strategy in harsh, urgent whispers. They were going to completely sanitize the federal raid. He instructed his family to act as though the government audit was nothing more than a minor, politically motivated compliance check that had temporarily and unfairly frozen their liquid assets. He planned to pitch his logistics firm as a highly profitable, fundamentally sound enterprise that simply required a short-term massive capital injection to clear a temporary bureaucratic hurdle. He would lie about their profit margins, fabricate their asset valuations, and completely bury the existence of the cooked books and Isaiah's devastating theft. Thomas was convinced that if he could just project his usual dominant, unshakable confidence, he could manipulate this unknown wealthy executive into buying his debt at a premium, viewing it as a highly lucrative acquisition rather than the toxic, rotting liability it actually was. The air conditioning in the boardroom was set to a crisp, refreshing temperature, but all four of them were visibly perspiring, suffocating under the weight of their own escalating lies. They sat rigidly in their chairs, rehearsing their fabricated financial metrics, desperately trying to polish a company that was already dead. The tension in the room was a thick, palpable force, wrapping around them like a vice. They stared at the heavy, frosted glass door, practically holding their breath, waiting to deploy their fraudulent charm on the gullible savior they assumed was coming to rescue them. Outside the soundproof glass, the deep, resonant silence of the executive suite was suddenly broken. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of high heels began to echo down the long mahogany hallway, moving with deliberate, unhurried authority directly toward the boardroom. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels began to echo down the long mahogany hallway, moving with deliberate, unhurried authority directly toward the boardroom. Each step was a physical manifestation of the absolute power I had cultivated in the shadows. I paused for a fraction of a second, just outside the heavy frosted glass doors, savoring the profound finality of this moment. My entire life had been a prelude to this exact intersection of time and space. With a crisp, authoritative motion, my lead corporate counsel pushed the double doors open, breaking the hermetic seal of the room. The meticulously rehearsed, desperate smiles on the faces of my family instantly shattered. They had clearly spent the last 20 minutes mentally preparing to grovel before an ancient cigar-smoking billionaire tycoon. Instead, the doorway framed their ultimate, inescapable nightmare. I stepped across the threshold flanked by two of the most ruthless, highly compensated corporate attorneys in the city. I was not the underachieving, discarded daughter they had spent a lifetime treating like an inconvenience. I was dressed for a corporate execution. My tailored midnight blue Tom Ford suit fit with razor-sharp perfection, radiating a cold, untouchable authority that commanded immediate submission. A vintage platinum Patek Philippe watch gleamed subtly against my wrist, a silent, indisputable testament to the massive wealth I controlled. I did not carry a notepad, a pen, or a cup of coffee. I carried absolutely nothing because the men standing beside me were paid an exorbitant hourly rate to carry my paperwork for me. I let the heavy, climate-controlled air of the boardroom settle as my eyes swept across the vast table, locking onto the pathetic, sweating quartet huddled at the far end like trapped animals. The sheer shockwave of my appearance paralyzed them entirely. The absolute cognitive dissonance of seeing their chosen scapegoat standing at the apex of the corporate world short-circuited their brains. Brittany's jaw dropped open, her red-rimmed eyes bulging as she took in the staggering cost of my attire, her own wrinkled travel clothes suddenly feeling like rags. Isaiah looked physically ill, shrinking back into his chair, as if he could merge with the leather and disappear from the face of the earth. Barbara simply blinked repeatedly, her brain misfiring, entirely unable to reconcile the commanding woman standing at the door with the invisible child she had banished from her pristine suburban life. But it was Thomas whose reaction was the most spectacularly volatile. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray, before a hot, violent flush of indignation rushed violently back into his cheeks. His deeply ingrained pathological arrogance acted as a reflex, violently overriding his momentary shock. He slammed his palms flat against the black marble table and shot up from his chair, the heavy leather scraping aggressively against the floor. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my chest, his voice booming with the toxic, demanding authority he had used to terrorize me since childhood. He demanded to know what on earth I was doing, interrupting his critical, high-stakes business meeting. He yelled that this was not the time for my petty, dramatic grievances, accusing me of sneaking into my boss's boardroom and playing dress-up in expensive clothes just to sabotage his one chance at survival. He commanded me to leave the room instantly before he had security drag me out by force, threatening to personally ensure I was fired from whatever administrative job I had managed to secure. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I did not offer a single word of defense, justification, or anger. I simply let his pathetic, desperate screaming echo off the soundproof glass walls until the vast emptiness of the room swallowed it whole. Without uttering a sound, I walked forward. My heels struck the marble floor with deliberate, measured precision, beating like a metronome, counting down the final seconds of his empire. I moved past my sputtering father, past my gaping mother, and past my trembling sister. I walked straight to the absolute head of the table. One of my attorneys smoothly pulled back the heavy, high-backed leather executive chair. I sat down, crossing my legs and folding my hands loosely in my lap, assuming the throne of the empire I had built entirely in their blind spot. The sheer quiet dominance of my movement forced a suffocating silence back into the room. Thomas stood awkwardly, his arms still half raised, the furious words dying in his throat as the reality of the power dynamic began to violently shift in his mind. The two elite attorneys took their places flanking my chair, standing like stone sentinels, their loyalties entirely undeniably focused on me. I looked at Thomas, watching the last lingering remnants of his ego, frantically trying to construct a narrative where he was still the most important person in the room. He slowly sank back down into his seat, his eyes darting frantically between my Patek Philippe watch, my tailored suit, and the cold, unyielding expressions of my legal team. The carefully constructed illusion of his superiority was evaporating right before his eyes. I gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to my left. My lead attorney stepped forward, opening a heavy combination-locked leather briefcase. He extracted 4 thick, identically bound legal portfolios, resting them on the edge of the polished black marble. These were not the sanitized, fabricated financial projections Thomas had spent the last hour rehearsing. These binders contained the raw, unvarnished autopsy of his ruined life. They held the foreclosure documents for the suburban mansion, the federal grand jury indictments, and the meticulously reconstructed ledgers, proving Isaiah's massive, unforgivable embezzlement. But most importantly, they contained the aggressive, non-negotiable buyout contracts that would officially transfer the remaining heavily depreciated assets of his logistics firm directly into my complete possession. Thomas stared down at the heavy binders bearing the gold-embossed logo of Phoenix Holdings. His hands were shaking too badly to even reach out. He looked up at me, his arrogance finally permanently extinguished, replaced by a hollow, terrifying comprehension. The air in the room was completely still, the silence absolute and suffocating. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the cool marble, holding his desperate, terrified gaze. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any trace of the daughter he once knew, leaving only the cold, absolute certainty of an apex predator closing its jaws. I instructed my lawyers to distribute the legal binders. I looked directly at Thomas and states, "I am the CEO. I am the sole owner of Phoenix Holdings." The absolute silence in the boardroom was heavy enough to crush bone. I watched the words wash over my father, observing the exact second his brain rejected the information short-circuited and finally surrendered to the undeniable reality sitting in front of him. The 2 corporate attorneys standing at my flanks moved with synchronized predatory grace. They unclasped the thick leather binders and slid them across the sleek surface of the table, positioning one directly in front of Thomas and another in front of Isaiah. The heavy thud of the portfolios settling against the table echoed like a judge's gavel. Thomas stared at the embossed cover, his breathing shallow and rapid. He reached out with a trembling hand and flipped the binder open. I gave him a moment to absorb the first page. It was a summary of asset acquisition drafted in clear, uncompromising legal terminology. I leaned back in my chair, steepled my fingers, and began to speak. My voice was calm, devoid of any anger or vindictiveness. It was the tone of a professional finalizing a very lucrative, completely unsentimental transaction. I detailed exactly what I had done over the past few weeks, while they were spiraling into panic. I explained that Phoenix Holdings had not merely acquired a fraction of his failing logistics firm. I had leveraged my capital to purchase his entire corporate debt portfolio. Every single outstanding loan, every breached line of credit, and every defaulted vendor contract had been aggressively bought out by my firm at a steep discount from creditors who were desperate to wash their hands of his fraudulent mess. But I had not stopped at the corporate level. I turned my attention to Barbara, whose perfectly manicured hands were gripping the edges of her leather chair so tightly her knuckles were white. I informed her that her beloved pristine suburban mansion was no longer the property of the bank that had issued the foreclosure notices earlier that week. Phoenix Holdings had purchased that mortgage as well. I owned the walls, the roof, the manicured lawn, and the custom swimming pool she used to entertain her shallow social circle. I had systematically dismantled their financial autonomy, cornered their debts, and consolidated their entire existence into a single portfolio. I held their entire future, their freedom, and their shelter firmly in the palm of my hand. Thomas tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as his eyes darted over the pages, proving my absolute ownership of his life. Isaiah was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as he stared at the itemized list of his offshore gambling transfers, fully realizing that I possessed the power to hand him over to the federal authorities with a single phone call. The suffocating pressure in the room finally cracked the weakest link. Brittany, who had been sitting in a state of catatonic shock since I entered the room, suddenly snapped. The accumulated trauma of being stranded in Greece, flying deep economy, losing her fake cryptocurrency wealth, and discovering that her despised, supposedly underachieving sister was actually a corporate titan proved to be too much for her fragile, entitled reality. She leaped up from her chair, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical screech that shattered the quiet dignity of the boardroom. "Where did you get this kind of money?" Brittany screamed. Her face flushed red, tears of absolute panic and fury streaming down her cheeks. She slammed her hands on the table, leaning forward wildly. "You were nothing. You lived in a terrible apartment. You could not even afford a proper coat. How is this possible?" I did not raise my voice or react to her outburst. I simply let her screaming fade into the soundproof walls. I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored jacket and withdrew a slim black archival envelope. I laid it flat on the table, unfastened the string closure, and pulled out a single sheet of heavy, glossy paper. It was a high-resolution, color-perfect photocopy, enlarged and enhanced to display every single detail with crystal clarity. I placed my fingertips on the edge of the paper and slid it smoothly across the long table. It glided over the polished surface, coming to a gentle stop perfectly centered between Thomas, Barbara, and Brittany. They stared down at it, their eyes locking onto the brightly colored graphic of a holiday-themed lottery ticket. It took them a few seconds to process the familiar layout, the scratched-off silver foil, and the matching sequence of numbers. They saw the date printed at the top. They saw the total prize amount authorized at the bottom. The realization hit them like a runaway freight train. I watched the blood drain entirely from Brittany's face as her knees buckled, sending her collapsing back into her chair. Barbara let out a sharp, breathless gasp, covering her mouth with her hands as her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror. Thomas looked like he had been physically struck, his rigid posture crumbling as he stared at the image of the exact same cheap, condescending joke gift he had shoved into my hands months ago. The absolute staggering irony of the situation settled over them, a crushing weight that pinned them to their seats. They had literally handed me the weapon of their own destruction. They had casually tossed away a massive fortune just to mock me, and I had used that exact same fortune to buy the ruins of their lives. I placed my hands flat on the table and leaned forward, ensuring that I held the undisputed center of their attention. I looked directly into my father's eyes, then shifted my gaze to my mother, and finally to my sister and brother-in-law. I let the silence stretch for one last agonizing second before I delivered the killing blow. "Thank you for the Thanksgiving gift," I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "Because of this $5 piece of paper, I am now your landlord, your creditor, and your boss, and you are all fired." The word fired hung in the freezing climate-controlled air of the boardroom like a physical executioner's blade. For 5 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The polished black marble table reflected their paralyzed, horrified faces as their brains struggled to process the total inversion of power. Then the dam broke, and the room erupted into absolute, unadulterated chaos. The pristine, intimidating silence of the executive suite was instantly obliterated by a cacophony of overlapping, desperate voices. It was a spectacular display of a family unit, completely disintegrating under the crushing weight of their own ruined egos. Barbara was the first to completely break character. The haughty, untouchable matriarch of suburban high society vanished in a fraction of a second. It was a breathtaking, horrifying metamorphosis. I watched as she forcefully swallowed her pride, her facial features contorting into a grotesque mask of manufactured maternal affection. Tears, sudden and entirely fabricated, sprang to her eyes, pooling over her expensive mascara. She scrambled out of her leather chair, her heels clicking frantically against the floor as she rushed around the table toward me. Her arms were wide-open hands grasping at the empty air, as if she were reaching for a lost child returning from a war. She tried to throw her arms around my neck, her voice breaking into a high theatrical sob of pure synthetic joy. She cried out my name, claiming she was so overwhelmed with pride. She actually had the unmitigated gall to sob that she always knew her brilliant girl would be the savior of this family. She babbled incoherently about how this was all destiny, a grand design to bring us back together completely. ignoring the fact that less than a year ago she had actively facilitated my expulsion from their lives. I leaned back sharply in my leather executive chair, raising a single rigid hand to stop her advance. My lead attorney immediately stepped forward, creating a physical barrier between my immaculate suit and her grasping, desperate claws. Barbara stopped hovering inches away, her fake tears glistening under the recessed lighting, her smile a desperate, trembling grimace. Seeing his mother-in-law completely debase herself triggered something within Isaiah. The man who had spent the last 3 years playing the role of an untouchable crypto-millionaire, the parasite who had systematically drained my father's illegal funds to fuel his own pathetic gambling addiction, realized that his ship had completely sunk. He recognized that I was the only lifeboat left in the ocean. With a sickening lack of dignity, Isaiah shoved his chair back and literally dropped to his knees on the cold marble floor. He crawled forward, ignoring Thomas, who sat nearby, staring into the void in absolute broken silence. Isaiah clasped his hands together in a gesture of pure pathetic supplication. His voice was slick, coated in the same repulsive charm he used to con his way into the family. He began begging smoothly, pivoting from a thief to a sycophant. He pleaded for a position within Phoenix Holdings. He insisted that I needed someone with his unique financial acumen, someone who understood the modern digital market. He wildly suggested that I appoint him as a vice president, arguing with a straight face that we needed to keep the wealth in the family. He spoke as if I had not just handed him a detailed, granular ledger proving he was a compulsive gambler and a prolific embezzler. His ability to compartmentalize his own criminality in the face of raw greed was staggering. He kneeled there, sweating through his wrinkled shirt, offering to be my loyal right hand, willing to sell out Thomas and Brittany, without a second thought if it meant he could attach his parasitic mouth to a new host. While Barbara groveled and Isaiah begged, Brittany chose the path of pure, unhinged entitlement. The golden child completely incapable of adapting to a reality where she was not the center of the universe simply imploded. She remained in her chair, her body rigid, hyperventilating so hard her chest heaved violently. Her face turned a mottled, furious shade of red, the veins in her neck protruding against her skin. She slammed both of her fists down onto the marble table, the impact rattling the crystal water glasses. She did not beg. She shrieked. Her voice reached a pitch that hurt the ears, a violent, ear-piercing tantrum of a spoiled toddler denied a toy. She screamed that the scratch-off ticket was a family gift. She wildly pointed at the enlarged photocopy of the winning ticket, spitting out the words with venomous rage. She insisted that because Thomas had purchased it and handed it to me at her dining table, it belonged to the collective estate. She shrieked that she was legally entitled to half of the absolute payout. She threatened to hire an army of lawyers, swearing to drag me through the courts for decades, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband had just bankrupted her father, and that my legal team standing silently beside me could bury any frivolous lawsuit before a clerk even filed it. She pounded the table again and again, screaming about fairness, demanding her share of the billions I had built, using the very $5 they had given me as an insult. I sat perfectly still in my high-backed chair, letting the storm of their pathetic reactions rage around me. I did not speak to Barbara. I did not acknowledge Isaiah on the floor. I did not react to Brittany's shrill, legally absurd threats. I simply observed them with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist watching bacteria under a microscope. The speed of their transformation was breathtaking. In the span of a single minute, they had transitioned from arrogant abusers looking to exploit a mid-level manager into groveling sycophants and entitled lunatics facing a billionaire. There was no remorse in this room. There were no apologies for the decades of emotional neglect, the constant belittling, the harsh comparisons, or the brutal rejection I had suffered. They did not see a daughter who had achieved the impossible. They did not see a sister who had pulled herself out of the dirt. They did not see a human being at all. Looking into their desperate, greedy, panicked eyes, I saw the absolute truth. They only saw a limitless, overflowing ATM. They only saw an endless source of capital to fund their continued delusions. Watching them tear themselves apart in front of me, abandoning all dignity and family loyalty for a chance at my money, extinguished whatever microscopic flicker of familial guilt might have remained in the very depths of my heart. The sickeningly fast transition from abusers to sycophants solidified my resolve into impenetrable diamond. The trap had not just sprung, it had crushed them entirely. The cacophony of their begging and screaming reverberated against the thick glass walls of the boardroom, creating a pathetic symphony of desperation. Barbara was still weeping dry synthetic tears, her hands outstretched in a grotesque pantomime of motherly love. Isaiah remained planted on his knees on the cold marble, sweating through his ruined shirt, rapidly pitching his non-existent value to a company he had just tried to defraud. Brittany continued to beat her fists against the table, her face a mottled mask of fury, as she shrieked her legally absurd demands for half of my fortune. I sat perfectly still, observing the sheer, unmitigated humiliation they were willing to inflict upon themselves for a fraction of my wealth. They had completely abandoned any pretense of dignity. The speed with which they had mutated from my lifelong tormentors into groveling sycophants only hardened the diamond of my resolve. They did not see a daughter sitting at the head of the table. They did not see a sister who had survived their endless cruelty. They looked at me and saw nothing but a massive, overflowing bank vault, a golden ticket meant to fund their hollow status-obsessed lives. I decided I had endured enough of the noise. With a single sharp gesture of my hand, I brought the circus to a dead halt. The motion was so abrupt, so laced with absolute chilling authority, that the frantic babbling died instantly in their throats. My lead attorney stepped forward, tapping a silver pen against the polished marble, the sharp crack commanding their complete, undivided silence. I spoke softly, forcing them to lean in, hanging on every word of their executioner. I addressed Brittany first, shutting down her unhinged entitlement with clinical surgical precision. I informed her that a scratch-off ticket purchased by our father and explicitly handed to me in front of multiple witnesses as a mockery constituted a legally binding unconditional gift. I walked her through the genesis of Phoenix Holdings, detailing exactly how the winnings were immediately secured within an irrevocable blind trust located in a jurisdiction specifically designed to shield assets from frivolous familial claims. I made it absolutely clear that my corporate entity was hermetically sealed. They had zero legal avenue to touch a single cent of my money, my investments, or the initial lottery payout. I advised her that any lawyer desperate or foolish enough to take her completely baseless case would be buried under a mountain of aggressive countersuits before the first brief was even filed. Brittany's mouth snapped shut, the remaining color draining from her face as the fantasy of a massive legal settlement evaporated into thin air. I then turned my gaze down to the floor, fixing my eyes on Isaiah. He looked up at me with the pathetic, wide-eyed hope of a stray dog expecting a scrap of meat. I dismantled his delusion with brutal efficiency. I informed him that I do not negotiate with felons, nor do I hire parasites who cannibalize the companies that employ them. I detailed exactly where his meticulously reconstructed embezzlement files were currently sitting, informing him that my legal team had already forwarded the unredacted ledgers to a federal prosecutor who specialized in corporate fraud. I refused to offer him a lifeline, a buyout, or even a fleeting moment of pity. I told him that I would not be bailing him out of the impending federal charges, and that his best course of action would be to find a very cheap, very aggressive defense attorney. Isaiah slumped forward, his forehead resting against the cold marble, a whimpering sound escaping his chest as the reality of a federal prison sentence crushed the last of his arrogant swagger. Finally, I shifted my attention to Thomas and Barbara. They were clinging to each other now, a pathetic display of solidarity born entirely out of mutual terror. I informed them that the foreclosure on their precious, meticulously decorated suburban estate was absolute and irreversible. As the new undisputed owner of their corporate debt and their mortgage, I had already instructed my firm to initiate the final aggressive eviction proceedings. I flatly refused their unspoken desperate hope that I would allow them to stay in the house as an act of familial charity. I told them they had exactly 48 hours to pack whatever personal clothing they could fit into standard moving boxes and vacate the premises. The house, the luxury vehicles, the country club memberships, everything that had defined their shallow materialistic existence was officially liquidated or seized by my holding company. There would be no grace period, no extended stay, and absolutely no financial allowance provided to help them keep up appearances. Barbara attempted one last desperate plea, reaching out with shaking hands, crying my name, begging for mercy in the name of our shared blood. I cut her off instantly, my voice dropping to a glacial temperature. I told her the family she spoke of died the day she watched her youngest daughter get thrown onto the freezing streets with nothing but a trash bag of clothes. The iron boundary was officially permanently forged. There was no bridge back, no hidden path to redemption, and absolutely zero room for negotiation. I raised my right hand and pressed a small discreet button recessed into the underside of the heavy marble table. Instantly, the heavy frosted glass doors at the back of the suite swung wide open. It was not the polite entrance of a corporate receptionist. The doorway filled with the synchronized heavy footfalls of my private security detail. 4 massively built men entered the room dressed in tactical black suits, their sheer physical presence suffocating any remaining thoughts of resistance. They did not speak a single word. They simply moved with ruthless, highly trained efficiency. I gave a single dismissive nod toward the far end of the boardroom. The guards immediately flanked my parents, Isaiah and Brittany. When Brittany began to thrash and scream furiously, demanding to speak to someone in charge, a guard simply secured her arms behind her back with terrifying, effortless ease. Isaiah was hauled to his feet by the collar of his ruined shirt, his legs practically giving out beneath him as he was forced to walk. Barbara sobbed uncontrollably, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks, while Thomas stared blankly ahead, his spirit completely and irreversibly broken by his own spectacular failure. I calmly instructed the head of security to bypass the main corporate lobby entirely. They were not to use the pristine glass elevators that overlook the city skyline. They were to be escorted directly to the freight elevator in the rear service corridor, the exit strictly reserved for trash removal and discreet building maintenance. I sat in my high-backed leather chair, my hands folded perfectly on the desk, and watched as the heavily armed guards forcefully dragged the screaming, crying remnants of my abusers out of the beautiful boardroom. The heavy glass doors sealed firmly shut behind them, instantly silencing their pathetic wails physically and permanently, removing them from my world. Hours after the boardroom doors sealed shut, the adrenaline of the corporate execution had completely dissolved, replaced by a profound, unshakable tranquility. I stood alone on the sprawling, wraparound balcony of my penthouse suite, 70 floors above the vibrant, sprawling grid of downtown Chicago. The evening air was crisp and biting, whipping off Lake Michigan and cutting through the fabric of the casual silk robe I had changed into. Below me, the city was a living, breathing organism of glowing arteries and towering monoliths of glass and steel. Millions of lives were playing out in the illuminated windows, completely oblivious to the empire I had violently secured just a few miles away. I rested my hands on the freezing metal railing, letting the sheer magnitude of the skyline anchor me to the present. For the first time in my entire existence, I was not looking over my shoulder. I was looking down. Behind me, through the floor-to-ceiling glass doors, the interior of the penthouse was bathed in soft, ambient light. Resting on the center of a polished quartz coffee table was my personal cell phone. I had deliberately left it inside, wanting a few uninterrupted moments of solitude to process the absolute victory of the afternoon. But the device was impossible to ignore. Even through the thick soundproof glass, I could see the screen violently lighting up the dim room. It was trapped in a continuous, frantic strobe effect, flashing with rapid-fire intensity as notification after notification flooded the device. It looked less like a communication tool and more like an emergency beacon signaling a catastrophic meltdown. I watched the frantic flashing for several minutes, feeling absolutely no compulsion to answer. Finally, I stepped back off the balcony, sliding the heavy glass door shut, sealing out the wind and the muted roar of the city below. I walked slowly toward the coffee table, my bare feet silent against the plush carpet. I picked up the device, the metal casing warm from the overworked battery. The screen was a chaotic wall of red notification bubbles. There were exactly 97 missed calls. Mixed within the missed calls were dozens of text messages, a rapid, desperate stream of consciousness pouring out from 4 people who had just been forcefully ejected from their own false reality. The digital barrage was a direct, pathetic manifestation of their total loss of control. They had no physical access to me, no financial leverage, and no social power to wield. They were reduced to screaming into the digital void, desperately hoping I would open the door just a crack to let their poison back in. I unlocked the screen and navigated directly to the voicemail inbox. There were 24 new audio messages waiting in the queue. I did not feel the familiar sickening spike of anxiety that usually accompanied communications from my family. Instead, I felt only a cold, clinical curiosity. I tapped the icon for the first message, set the phone down on the table, and activated the speakerphone. I poured myself a glass of chilled, sparkling water from the bar cart, letting their panic serve as the background music to my newfound peace. Thomas's voice filled the quiet penthouse first. He was practically roaring into the microphone, his toxic, demanding rage entirely untempered by his recent spectacular defeat. He commanded me to pick up the phone immediately. He spewed venom, demanding respect, ordering me to reverse the asset acquisition, and threatening to utterly destroy me in the press. He sounded like a deposed dictator issuing orders to an army that had already surrendered. His bluster was completely hollow, his threats legally toothless. He was a man screaming at a hurricane, entirely incapable of accepting that his reign of terror had been permanently dismantled. I took a slow sip of water, completely unmoved by his fury. The next message rolled in seamlessly. It was Barbara. She had abandoned the overt rage for her signature weapon of choice, manipulative gaslighting, emotional warfare. Her voice was trembling, choked with thick theatrical sobs. She cried out my name, pleading with me to remember the good times, spinning a completely fabricated narrative of a loving, supportive childhood. She begged me not to tear the family apart, accusing me of being cruel and vindictive, entirely ignoring the fact that she had literally left me on the streets with nothing. She tried to invoke maternal guilt, twisting the narrative so that I was the aggressor, and they were the innocent, misunderstood victims. Her performance was Oscar-worthy, a masterclass in narcissistic deflection, but to my ears, it just sounded like desperate, pathetic noise. Then came Isaiah. His message was a frantic, rapid-fire stream of hollow legal threats. He threw around words like injunctions, breach of contract, and fiduciary duty, stringing together corporate buzzwords that made absolutely no sense in the context of what had transpired. He was terrified, trying to project strength while his entire world collapsed around him, paralyzed by the fear that the federal investigators were already knocking on his door. Brittany's messages were pure, unadulterated tantrums. She screamed into the receiver, demanding her money, demanding her house back, shrieking that I had ruined her life and stolen her future. The sheer volume of their collective panic was staggering. I stood by the quartz table listening as the voicemails played one after another, a relentless symphony of their destruction. For 3 decades, these voices had controlled my self-worth, dictated my anxiety, and orchestrated my misery. Now, they were nothing more than digital artifacts, compressed audio files lacking any real power. I let the final message play out until the automated voice informed me that the end of the inbox had been reached. I picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over the screen. I tapped the settings icon, navigated through the menu, and selected the prompt that read, "Delete all voicemails." I confirmed the action without a single second of hesitation. The red notification bubble vanished instantly. But deleting the messages was not enough. I opened the dialer and contacted the premium priority customer service line for my cellular provider. An agent answered on the first ring. I provided my security PIN and issued a single non-negotiable directive. I instructed them to permanently deactivate my current phone number and issue a new unlisted one immediately. I confirmed the transfer authorized the immediate cutoff and ended the call. Within 10 seconds, the signal bars at the top of my screen dropped to zero. The connection was physically and permanently severed. The screen went black, reflecting my own calm, steady expression. I set the dead device back down on the table. The frantic digital strobe was gone. The toxic voices were erased. Total absolute silence finally reigned in the penthouse. The absolute silence that settled over the penthouse that night was not a temporary reprieve. It was the permanent baseline of my new existence. When I woke the next morning, the world felt fundamentally altered. I did not check for missed calls, nor did I brace myself for an inevitable ambush of manufactured crises. The machinery I had methodically set into motion during that boardroom meeting required absolutely no further input from me. It operated with cold mechanical efficiency, grinding the remnants of their fabricated reality into dust over the ensuing months. I simply watched from a distance, completely detached from the fallout, as the dominoes fell exactly as I had calculated. The first to completely collapse under the weight of his own hubris was Isaiah. The unredacted, meticulously compiled ledgers my legal team handed over to the federal prosecutor were an absolute goldmine. There was no need for a protracted investigation or a desperate search for a smoking gun. The evidence was irrefutable, painting a pristine, undeniable picture of rampant wire fraud and gross embezzlement. The morning the federal agents executed the raid on his corporate office was a spectacle of public humiliation. Witnesses later reported seeing the untouchable crypto-millionaire escorted out of his glass-walled suite in handcuffs. His expensive suit wrinkled his arrogant swagger, entirely replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. He had gambled away his illicitly gained fortune, leaving him utterly incapable of mounting a credible legal defense. Without my capital to bail him out or hire a team of elite fixers, Isaiah was assigned an overworked public defender who took one look at the mountain of forensic accounting and immediately advised him to plead guilty. The charges were severe. He was not looking at a slap on the wrist or a brief stint in a minimum security facility. He was facing decades in federal prison, his entire future erased by the very greed he thought made him invincible. While Isaiah was being processed through the federal justice system, the execution of the foreclosure on my parents' estate proceeded with absolute unforgiving punctuality. The 48 hours I had granted them expired, and the eviction was enforced. The spectacle of their departure from the affluent gated community was the final brutal nail in the coffin of their social standing. The neighbors, the same high society friends Barbara had spent decades trying to impress, watched from behind their custom drapery as generic moving trucks hauled away whatever meager possessions had not been seized by my holding company to cover their massive defaulted debts. There was no grand farewell, no sympathetic outpouring from their country club peers. They were simply excised from the neighborhood like a localized infection. Their new reality was a cramped, run-down apartment complex located on the industrial outskirts of the city. The manicured lawns and sweeping driveways were replaced by cracked asphalt and flickering fluorescent hallway lights. The interior of their new unit smelled permanently of damp carpet and stale cooking grease. Without the influx of my stolen capital or the illusion of Isaiah's wealth, Thomas and Barbara were violently thrust into the brutal reality of surviving entirely on Thomas's meager, severely depleted pension. The math was unforgiving. Every dollar was suddenly a matter of survival, reducing Barbara from a haughty matriarch hosting lavish dinner parties into a bitter, resentful woman clipping coupons just to keep the lights on. Their social calendar evaporated entirely, leaving them trapped in a tiny claustrophobic box with nothing but their own colossal failures for company. The sheer indignity of carrying their own groceries up 3 flights of concrete stairs became a daily crushing reminder of the empire they had squandered. The collateral damage of Isaiah's federal indictment completely obliterated Brittany's golden child existence. Because her lifestyle was entirely funded by his fraudulent activities, the authorities swiftly moved to freeze all of their joint assets. The luxury vehicles were repossessed, the designer wardrobes were flagged for liquidation, and the bottomless bank accounts were locked tight. Brittany, a woman who had never developed a single marketable skill or held a demanding job in her entire life, was suddenly faced with the terrifying prospect of supporting herself. The transition from luxury boutiques and afternoon spa treatments to the brutal reality of the service industry was a shattering blow to her fragile, entitled ego. Desperate to make rent on a cheap studio apartment, she was forced to take a full-time position as a waitress at a high-volume roadside diner. The girl who had once thrown epic tantrums over the wrong shade of imported marble was now spending 8 hours a day on her feet, wearing a cheap polyester uniform stained with coffee and fryer oil. She was forced to endure the demands of rude customers, clean up spilled food, and count loose change at the end of grueling, humiliating shifts just to buy groceries. The total erosion of her unearned status stripped away her arrogance, leaving behind a hollow, exhausted shell of the sister I once knew. For 3 decades, I had served as the foundational pillar of their dysfunction. I was the designated scapegoat, the emotional punching bag they relentlessly utilized to absorb their collective failures and project their deep-seated insecurities. I was the unifying target that kept their deeply flawed relationships intact. By permanently removing myself from the equation and simultaneously detonating their financial security, I completely eliminated their singular coping mechanism. Forced into cramped quarters, crippled by poverty, and facing the harsh, undeniable truth of their own incompetence, they turned their vitriol inward. Without me there to absorb the damage, the toxic family dynamic violently inverted. They blamed each other for the collapse. Thomas blamed Barbara for her extravagant spending and endless demands. Barbara blamed Thomas for his financial spinelessness and inability to provide. They both blamed Brittany for marrying a criminal, and Brittany viciously blamed them all for failing to protect her from the real world. The entire unit rapidly cannibalized itself, tearing each other apart day after day in a desperate, futile attempt to escape the reality of the ruin they had entirely brought upon themselves. The air in my new office is completely still, and for the first time in my life, that silence does not feel like a threat. It has been exactly 14 months since I walked out of that boardroom, leaving my family to choke on the ashes of their own entitlement. 14 months of absolute, uninterrupted peace. I have not received a single text, email, or phone call from them. Or if I have, I wouldn't know. The block on their numbers was the first brick I laid in building my new life, and my legal team handles any desperate attempts they make to circumvent it. I instructed my attorneys to intercept any communication, return any packages, and reject any olive branches that are undoubtedly just disguised traps. They are ghosts to me now, echoes of a past I have entirely outgrown, and the space they used to occupy has been filled with something they could never understand: profound serenity. My days look entirely different than they used to. I wake up in a home that I chose, paid for with money I earned, and decorated exactly to my taste. I no longer brace myself for the sudden ringing of my phone. There are no sudden demands for exorbitant loans, no manipulative guilt trips masquerading as family emergencies, and no constant undercurrent of anxiety that the people who are supposed to protect me are secretly plotting my ruin. I am thriving in ways I never thought possible when I was still trapped in their web. The business ventures I secured have multiplied, yielding returns that far exceeded even my most optimistic projections. I sit on the boards of 3 major companies, my advice sought after and respected by industry veterans who judge me solely on my merit, not on my compliance to a toxic family hierarchy. I am respected for my mind, my strategy, and my execution, free from the shadow of their impossible expectations and relentless criticisms. But the most profound shift hasn't been in my portfolio. It has been in my entire perspective on wealth. Growing up, I was taught that money was a weapon, a tool for control, a leash to yank when someone stepped out of line. I watched wealth be used to demand submission and punish independence. I saw how it was dangled as a reward for obedience and snatched away the moment a thought of rebellion crossed my mind. For a long time, I thought having money meant I would just become a different kind of target, something to be extracted from rather than loved. Now, sitting at my desk and reviewing the quarterly reports of my personal estate, I understand the truth. I look at those numbers, and I do not see designer clothes, luxury cars, or sprawling estates. I see an impenetrable fortress. That is what my money truly bought me. It didn't just buy comfort or status. It bought a moat-high walls and a heavy iron gate that keeps the toxicity completely locked out. It bought the ultimate luxury, the power to say no and walk away without a single second thought. It bought me the privilege of my own undeniable sovereignty. That realization sparked a fire in me that nothing could extinguish. I knew exactly what it felt like to be trapped in a financially abusive household, to have your dreams held hostage by people controlling the purse strings, to feel like your survival depends on shrinking yourself to fit their demands. I remembered the nights I stayed awake, calculating how many shifts I needed to work to afford basic necessities while they tried to leverage my future. I had fought my way out tooth and nail, relying on sheer willpower and a refusal to break. But I also knew that grit alone isn't always enough. Sometimes you need actual resources. You need capital. You need someone to hand you the key to your own fortress so you can finally lock the door from the inside. So I decided to become that someone. I took a significant fraction of my wealth and established a targeted scholarship fund. I named it the Independence Initiative. It is completely dedicated to young women who are actively escaping financially abusive families or toxic environments. I spent months working with legal experts, social workers, and financial advisors to ensure the fund was absolutely bulletproof. The fund does not just cover tuition. It covers housing, living expenses, textbooks, and comprehensive mental health support, removing every possible financial barrier that a manipulative family could use to reel them back in. I specifically structured it to support degrees in business finance and economics. I want to arm these women with the exact same financial literacy that saved my life. I want them to understand markets, investments, and wealth management so they never have to rely on anyone else for their security. I want them to know how to read a contract, how to negotiate their worth, and how to build their own empires from the ground up. Meeting the first cohort of scholarship recipients was one of the most emotional and validating days of my life. I sat across the boardroom table from 10 brilliant, determined young women who looked exactly like I did years ago. They had the same exhaustion in their eyes, the same lingering doubt installed by toxic parents who told them they would never amount to anything, but they also possessed that same unbreakable steel in their spines. I looked at them and saw the future. I saw a generation of women who would build their own wealth and refuse to be diminished by anyone. When I handed them their award letters, the room was filled with tears of relief. I made sure they understood the terms. The only thing I asked in return was that they never compromise their independence for anyone, blood or otherwise. Watching them walk out of that room, shoulders back and heads held high, ready to take on the world, I felt a profound sense of completion. The trauma my family inflicted on me could have turned me bitter. It could have made me exactly like them, hoarding resources and using power to manipulate and control others. Instead, I took the very thing they tried to use against me and turned it into an engine for mass liberation. Every time one of my scholars graduates, starts a business, or secures a high-paying job, another piece of my family's toxic legacy is dismantled. They thought they could break me, but they only succeeded in forging a weapon that will destroy the very concept of financial abuse for countless women. I am no longer the scapegoat. I am no longer the bank. I am the architect of my own destiny, and I am actively handing out the blueprints to anyone who needs them. Healing is not just about cutting off the infection. It is about what you grow in the space left behind. I grew a fortress, and now I am building an entire city where people like us can finally be safe, successful, and entirely free. Money doesn't buy happiness. but it buys the power to walk away from people who demand your misery. Sometimes the worst, most humiliating gift they throw at you becomes the exact key to your absolute freedom. Have you ever cut off a toxic family member to protect your peace? Tell me your story in the comments below. Hit the like button, and remember your value is never determined by people who refuse to see it. The most profound lesson from this narrative is that true wealth is not measured by material luxury, but by the absolute freedom it provides. Financial independence serves as the ultimate boundary against toxic manipulation. When you strip away the leverage that abusers use to command submission, you reclaim your personal sovereignty. However, individual liberation is merely the beginning. Genuine healing blossoms when we transform our deepest pain into a protective fortress for others, ensuring they never have to endure those same invisible chains. Please share your story about turning a difficult situation into empowerment in the comments below.